There are places where the Earth itself becomes a palimpsest, where layer upon layer of forgotten existence lies beneath the surface, waiting for wind, water, or the patient eye of technology to reveal what time has buried. The Sahara is such a place. We think of it as emptiness, as absence, as a vast and hostile void where nothing grows and nothing has ever flourished. Yet this perception is perhaps the greatest deception the desert has ever perpetrated, a lie 9 million square kilometres wide, whispered in the language of dunes and silence, repeated so often that we have come to accept it as truth. But the sand remembers, the rock remembers, and now, with instruments that peer beneath the golden shroud, with satellites that trace ancient watercourses and algorithms that read the scars of vanished rivers, we are beginning to remember too. Consider what it means to stand at the edge of a depression so vast it can be seen from space, a structure so geometrically perfect that early astronauts mistook it for the work of intelligence rather than geology. Consider the Eye of the Sahara, that great spiral wound into the flesh of Mauritania, 40 kilometres across, its concentric rings descending into depths that have never been fully mapped or understood. From orbit it stares upward like the iris of some sleeping titan, embedded in the Adrar Plateau, surrounded by nothing but rock and wind and the fading memory of water. Mainstream science tells us this is a geological dome, an anticline eroded over millions of years, its layers stripped away by forces we claim to understand. And perhaps this is so. Perhaps this is all it is. Yet the structure defies simple categorization in ways that continue to invite deeper questions, and the more closely we examine it, the stranger it becomes. The rings themselves are composed of different rock types, sedimentary and igneous intermixed in patterns that suggest processes far more complex than simple erosion. Hydrothermal veins thread through the formation, evidence of superheated water flowing through rock at temperatures exceeding several hundred degrees, leaving behind minerals that have no business existing in such concentrations, in such arrangements, in such a place. The outermost ring consists of a breccia unlike any found elsewhere in the region, a chaotic mixture of angular fragments suspended in a matrix that speaks of violent, sudden formation rather than the slow patience of geological time. And at the centre, at the very heart of the eye, lies a feature that has troubled researchers for decades, a small rise of rock that some have suggested represents the remnant of a volcanic plug, though no volcanic activity has been conclusively demonstrated, while others have proposed more speculative origins that mainstream geology has been reluctant to embrace. What strikes one most forcefully about the Richat structure is not merely its size or its geometric precision, but its context, its placement in a landscape that 6,000 years ago looked nothing like it does today. We know this because the Sahara has not always been a desert. This fact, so counterintuitive to our modern understanding, is now beyond scientific dispute. Between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, during a period paleoclimatologists call the African Humid Period, the Sahara was green. Not merely less arid than today, not merely dotted with occasional oases, but genuinely verdant, covered with lakes and rivers and grasslands, supporting populations of hippopotami and crocodiles and elephants, home to cultures whose traces we're only now beginning to uncover. The wet Sahara was a world unto itself, a vast habitable zone connecting sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean, a corridor through which ideas, technologies and peoples could flow with an ease that the modern desert makes nearly unimaginable. Rock art found throughout the region confirms this wet phase with vivid, almost overwhelming clarity. In the Tassili Naja of Algeria, in the Akarkas Mountains of Libya, in scattered locations across Niger and Chad and Mauritania, ancient artists painted and carved images of a world that no longer exists. Cattle herders tend their animals beside lakes that have not held water for millennia. Hunters pursue giraffes and buffalo across savannas, now buried beneath meters of sand. Swimmers, their bodies rendered with startling anatomical precision, glide through waters that evaporated before the pharaohs built their pyramids at Giza. These images are not fantasies, not mythological projections of some imagined paradise. They are records, documentation of a reality so thoroughly erased by climate change that we might have doubted it ever existed, had the artists not left their testimony etched into stone. And here lies the central mystery that this journey will explore, the question that haunts every site we will visit, every vanished lake and buried city an impossible structure. If the Sahara was green for 6,000 years, if it supported populations and cultures sophisticated enough to leave behind art of extraordinary beauty and technical skill, what else did it support? What cities rose beside those vanished lakes? What technologies were developed? What knowledge accumulated? What civilizations flourished and then disappeared beneath the advancing sand, leaving behind only hints, only anomalies, only questions that mainstream archaeology has struggled to answer? The wet Sahara ended roughly 5,000 years ago, which places its final centuries in a period for which we have written records from Egypt and Mesopotamia, evidence of complex urban societies with administration and taxation and monumental architecture. Were similar societies developing in the Green Sahara only to be erased by a climate catastrophe so thorough that their very memory was lost? These are not idle speculations. They are questions raised by the evidence itself, by discoveries that do not fit neatly into conventional chronologies, by anomalies that continue to resist simple explanation. And so, we begin our journey here, at the eye of the Sahara, where the earth has opened in concentric rings like the ripples from a stone dropped into still water, frozen in time, preserved by the very aridity that buried so much else. What lies at the centre of this structure? What forces created it? And when and why does it exist at all in this particular location, aligned to cardinal directions with a precision that some have called suspicious and others have called coincidental? The questions multiply the closer we look. This is the nature of the Sahara's secrets. They do not yield to casual inquiry. They demand patience, attention, and a willingness to hold multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously, to accept that the story we have been told may be incomplete. Our journey shifts eastward now, across borders that exist only on maps, across landscapes that pay no attention to human boundaries, toward the sunken mountains of Libya and the remains of a people whose engineering achievements rival those of any ancient civilization, yet whose name remains largely unknown outside academic circles, the Garamantes. Even the word carries a certain weight, a certain strangeness, as if the syllables themselves resist easy pronunciation, resist being domesticated by modern tongues. The Romans knew them, the Greeks knew them. Herodotus wrote of them in the 5th century BCE, describing a powerful nation that hunted cave-dwelling Ethiopians in 4-horse chariots, a people who lived deep in the desert where no nation should have been able to survive, let alone thrive. And for centuries Western scholars dismissed these accounts as exaggeration, as fantasy, as the kind of traveller's tale that ancient historians were prone to embellish. The desert, after all, could not support a significant population. Everyone knew this, it was obvious. And then the archaeologists began to dig. What they found in the Wadi al-Ajal and the surrounding regions of the Libyan Fezzan has transformed our understanding of what was possible in the ancient Sahara. The Garamantes were not a scattered tribe of nomadic raiders, as earlier assumptions had suggested. They were the builders of cities. They were the engineers of an underground water network so extensive, so sophisticated, that scholars now estimate it may have included more than 1,000 kilometres of tunnels, carved through rock with tools we still do not fully understand, maintained for centuries by a society whose organisational capacity demands serious revision of our assumptions about desert civilization. These tunnels, known as foggara or kanat, tapped into fossil water reserves buried deep beneath the surface, aquifers that had accumulated during the wet Sahara phase, and remained sealed underground like time capsules, waiting for someone with the knowledge and the audacity to reach them. The city of Garama, capital of this improbable civilization, flourished from roughly 500 BCE to 600 CE, a span of 1100 years, longer than Rome maintained its empire, longer than any modern nation has yet existed. At its peak, the city may have supported a population of several thousand, supplied by water drawn from reservoirs that contained no renewable inflow, that represented the slow expenditure of a finite resource accumulated over millennia of wetter climate. The Garamantes understood this, in some sense. They knew they were mining rather than harvesting, depleting rather than sustaining, and yet they continued, building ever deeper tunnels, reaching ever further into the aquifer, creating an elaborate network of shafts and galleries whose total excavated volume may have exceeded 4 million cubic meters. This represents more earth moved than in the construction of several pyramids at Giza. This represents engineering on a scale that suggests centralised planning, specialised knowledge, and labour organisation of a kind we associate with state-level societies, not desert nomads. How did they do it? The mainstream explanation points to the gradual accumulation of hydraulic knowledge over generations, techniques borrowed perhaps from Persia, where similar Qanat systems originated, adapted to local conditions by trial and error over centuries. And perhaps this is so. Perhaps the foggara represent nothing more than the patient ingenuity of a people determined to survive in an impossible environment, learning from their neighbours, innovating where necessary, passing down knowledge from parent to child until the cumulative effect resembled something miraculous. But certain aspects of the system continue to invite deeper questions. The precision of the tunnel gradients, for instance, which maintain consistent slopes over kilometres of underground distance, allowing water to flow by gravity alone, without mechanical assistance, without the pumping technology that would not become widespread for another 2,000 years. The ventilation shafts that dot the surface above the tunnels, spaced at intervals so regular they suggest mathematical planning rather than empirical adjustment. The dating of the earliest tunnels, which some researchers have pushed back to periods that predate the supposed introduction of Qanat technology from Persia, raising the question of whether the Garamantes invented these techniques independently, or whether they inherited them from some earlier, unknown civilization whose knowledge they preserved while the culture itself vanished. Standing at the edge of one of these ancient shafts today, looking down into the darkness where cool air still rises from tunnels that carried water before Christ was born, one cannot help but wonder what else lies beneath the Saharan surface, waiting to be discovered. The foggara of the Garamantes have been studied for decades, yet new tunnels are still being found, new sections of the network revealed by ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery. If this civilization, known to the ancient world, mentioned by classical historians, could remain essentially undiscovered until the 20th century, what other civilizations might lie buried deeper still, beneath the sand that accumulated when the rain stopped, beneath the dunes that grew when the lakes dried, beneath the silence that fell when the green Sahara became the golden void we know today. The question becomes more pressing when we turn our attention to the lakes themselves, to the vast bodies of water that once covered tens of thousands of square kilometres of what is now empty desert. Lake Megaphezon, as modern geologists have named it, was the largest of these, a freshwater sea covering an area roughly equivalent to the country of Belgium, existing in what is now southwestern Libya during the wet Sahara phase. Other megalakes dotted the landscape, connected by river systems whose channels can still be traced from space, ghost tributaries of a drainage network that once rivaled the Nile. Lake Chad, which exists today as a shrinking remnant surrounded by encroaching desert, was during the African humid period a body of water the size of the Caspian Sea, so vast that its shores lay hundreds of kilometres from the current lake edge, so deep that some researchers believe it may have supported maritime cultures whose boats have never been found because no one has looked in the right places. The rock art confirms the presence of these lakes with testimony that seems almost too vivid to credit. In the Enedi region of Chad, in the Tibesti Mountains, in locations scattered across what is now among the most hostile terrain on Earth, ancient artists depicted fishing scenes. They painted boats, they carved images of aquatic animals, of nets and harpoons, and figures swimming with the easy confidence of people born to water. These are not metaphors. These are not spiritual symbols whose aquatic nature should be interpreted allegorically. These are representations of daily life in a landscape utterly transformed from its modern state, a landscape in which water was abundant, in which fishing supplemented herding, in which the very concept of desert would have been as foreign to the inhabitants as the concept of sea is foreign to us when we imagine the Sahara today. And among these images, scattered through the rock galleries like messages left specifically for us to find, are figures that resist easy interpretation. The so-called round head paintings of Tassili Naja, dating perhaps to 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, depict beings whose forms are not quite human, whose proportions suggest something other, whose ceremonial contexts hint at spiritual beliefs we cannot recover but can only guess at. Figures wearing what appear to be helmets or masks, or perhaps depicting cranial shapes that do not match any known population. Scenes of ritual significance that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of shamanic practice, of altered states of consciousness, of contact with dimensions of reality that our materialist frameworks struggle to accommodate. These interpretations remain controversial, contested, speculative, and yet the images themselves are undeniable. They exist, someone painted them, and the hands that held the pigment did so with intention, with skill, with a purpose that mattered enough to preserve in stone. What civilization produced these images? What social structures supported the specialized artistic practice that the corpus represents? The training and tradition that allowed techniques to be refined over centuries? The surplus economy that freed individuals from subsistence labor long enough to create works of such quality and quantity? We do not know. We cannot know with the evidence currently available. The wet Sahara ended so abruptly, geologically speaking, that the cultures inhabiting it had perhaps a few hundred years to adapt, to migrate, to carry their knowledge elsewhere before the advancing desert erased all surface traces of their presence. Some, presumably, moved southward into sub-Saharan Africa. Others may have moved north, toward the Mediterranean coast, perhaps contributing to the mysterious populations that Egyptian records refer to as Libyans, without further specification. Others may have died in place, their settlements buried, their bones scattered, their stories silenced by the sand that covered everything. But the rock art survived. The paintings, created on stone surfaces in caves and overhangs where the elements could not reach them, endured while everything else disappeared. They survived because stone remembers what sand forgets. They survived as testimony, as evidence, as questions without answers preserved across millennia. And among those questions, one recurs with particular insistence. The question that has driven speculation about pre-Saharan civilization since the first European explorers began documenting these images in the 19th century. How sophisticated were these cultures, really? Were they simple pastoralists, as mainstream archaeology has generally assumed, people of a limited technology whose artistic achievements should not be taken as evidence of broader cultural complexity? Or were they something more, something that the evidence, properly interpreted, might reveal, something that the desert has hidden, and that we are only now beginning to uncover? The legend of Zazura enters here, that persistent myth of a white city somewhere in the Libyan desert, a place of wealth and beauty protected by sleeping giants, known to medieval Arab geographers and sought by European adventurers well into the 20th century. For centuries, Zazura was dismissed as fantasy, a desert mirage translated into folklore, a Saharan El Dorado that existed only in the hopes of treasure hunters. But recent decades have brought a curious development. Satellite imagery, capable of penetrating the shallow surface of sand to reveal underlying bedrock and ancient watercourses, has identified numerous sites that match the broad outlines of the Zazura legend. Buried valleys that could have supported permanent settlement, anomalous geometric patterns in regions that remain unexcavated, unexplored, essentially unknown, features that might be natural, might be nothing, or might be exactly what the legends described, the remains of settlements so thoroughly buried that ground-based archaeology never had a chance of finding them. The Gilf Kabir Plateau, in southwestern Egypt near the Libyan border, has been particularly productive of such anomalies. This massive sandstone formation, roughly the size of Switzerland, rises from the surrounding desert like a fortress, its cliffs riddled with caves that contain some of the most significant rock art in the Sahara. The Cave of Swimmers, made famous by the novel and film The English Patient, depicts exactly what its name suggests: figures swimming through water that has not existed in this location for at least 8,000 years. Other caves contain images of similar antiquity, similar quality, similar questions. And throughout the plateau, in valleys and wadis that were once riverine environments, satellite imagery reveals features that continue to resist definitive interpretation, patterns that might be nothing more than eroded rock, or that might be something else entirely. Our journey continues southward now, toward the Nile, toward a civilization whose monuments stand exposed rather than buried, yet whose true extent and significance remain subjects of active debate. The pyramids of Sudan, the structures that tourists overlook in their rush to Egypt, the necropolis of Meroë and its predecessors, which some researchers argue represent not a provincial outpost of Egyptian culture, but an independent tradition whose roots may predate the pharaohs themselves. This is controversial territory. It challenges narratives so deeply embedded in our understanding of ancient history that questioning them feels almost improper, almost disrespectful to established scholarship. And yet the evidence invites such questioning, demands it, refuses to let the matter rest in comfortable consensus. The Kingdom of Kush, of which Meroë was the final capital, controlled territory along the Nile for well over 1,000 years, from roughly 1070 BCE to 350 CE. At various points it dominated Egypt itself, providing the 25th dynasty of pharaohs who ruled the entire Nile Valley, from Nubia to the Mediterranean. The Kushites were not peripheral. They were not recipients of Egyptian culture who adapted it imperfectly. They were participants in a civilization that may have had roots far older than conventional chronology admits, a civilization whose pyramids, though smaller than those at Giza, are far more numerous, more than 250 of them clustered in royal cemeteries that speak of continuity, of tradition, of a cultural practice sustained across generations without interruption. But when did this tradition begin? Mainstream Egyptology dates the earliest Kushite pyramids to the 8th century BCE, placing them firmly in the Iron Age, making them derivative of Egyptian models developed more than 2,000 years earlier. And yet certain features of the Kushite tradition continue to puzzle researchers. The proportions of the pyramids differ from Egyptian norms, steeper and narrower, as if following a different aesthetic or mathematical principle. The burial practices, while influenced by Egypt, retain elements that appear older, more aligned with traditions predating pharaonic civilization. And the location of Meroë itself, hundreds of kilometers south of the Nile's first cataract, in a region that during the wet Sahara phase would have been far more accessible than it is today, raises questions about what settlements might have preceded it, what cultures might have occupied this territory when the surrounding landscape was green rather than golden. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in the area have revealed structures beneath the sand that do not appear on any map, features that might be later constructions buried by drift, or that might be earlier, undocumented, potentially significant. The Nile Valley, it should be remembered, is not separate from the Sahara but continuous with it. During the wet phase, rivers from the Sahara flowed into the Nile, contributing to its volume, connecting its valley to points far into the interior. The populations of the Green Sahara did not exist in isolation from the Nile cultures. They traded, intermarried, shared ideas and technologies. When the Sahara dried, when those populations migrated, some of them surely moved toward the Nile, carrying with them whatever knowledge their ancestors had accumulated over 6,000 years of wet phase habitation. What did they carry? What did they know? What contributions did they make to the riverine civilizations that emerged shortly after their arrival? Civilizations whose seemingly sudden sophistication has always seemed to require explanation. From Meroë, our attention turns westward again, toward the coast of Mauritania, and a chain of settlements whose existence was essentially unknown to Western archaeology until the 1970s, Tichit Walata. The name sounds obscure, marginal, unimportant, and yet what lies there challenges some of our most fundamental assumptions about the development of African civilization. These are not Egyptian sites. They are not Mediterranean in influence. They are purely African, purely indigenous, purely the product of cultures that developed in the Sahara during its wet phase and adapted as best they could when the rain stopped. And what they built, what they left behind, suggests a level of social organisation that demands serious attention. The Tichit Walata sites consist of stone settlements, constructed on cliff edges overlooking what were once lakes or marshes, dating to between 2000 and 500 BCE. At their peak, some of these settlements may have housed several thousand people, making them among the earliest urban or proto-urban sites in West Africa. The walls are substantial, the layout systematic, the architectural choices deliberate in ways that speak of planning rather than improvisation. More striking still, the sites show evidence of agricultural experimentation, of the domestication of wild grains, including what would eventually become West African pearl millet, one of the most important crops in human history. These people were not passive victims of climate change. They were innovators, adapters, creators of solutions that allowed them to persist in a deteriorating environment long past the point where simpler societies might have collapsed or fled. And yet the Tichit Walata chain remains understudied, underappreciated, essentially absent from popular understanding of ancient African history. Why? Perhaps because it does not fit easily into existing narratives. Perhaps because its existence complicates the story we prefer to tell, the story in which civilization always flows from certain centres to certain peripheries, in which innovation always originates in certain places and never others. Perhaps because the Sahara, that great blank space on our maps, has been too easily dismissed as a void, a barrier, a nothing place through which nothing of importance ever moved. But the evidence at Tchit-Walata tells a different story. It tells a story of complexity, of creativity, of human achievement in conditions that should have made achievement impossible. It tells a story that is only beginning to be understood. We come finally to the most recent chapter in this unfolding saga of Saharan rediscovery, to the technologies that are now revealing what centuries of ground-based exploration could never find. LIDAR, that extraordinary tool that allows us to strip away vegetation and sand and centuries of accumulated obscurity to see the bare earth beneath. In tropical environments, LIDAR has revolutionized archaeology, revealing Maya cities beneath jungle canopies, Angkor period settlements hidden for centuries under forest growth. And now, increasingly, researchers are turning the same technology toward the Sahara, toward the question of what lies beneath the dunes, toward the possibility that entire civilizations have been waiting there, patient as stone, for someone to finally look. The Tadrat Carcass Mountains of southwestern Libya have been among the most productive of these investigations. Already known for their extraordinary rock art, which UNESCO has recognized as a World Heritage Site, the region has recently yielded evidence of structures that cannot be explained as natural formations, geometric patterns and aligned features that suggest deliberate human construction. The finds remain preliminary, contested, interpreted differently by different researchers, with different assumptions and different willingness to speculate. But they exist, they are documented, and they add to the growing body of evidence that the Sahara, far from being the empty quarter it appears, is in fact one of the richest archaeological territories on Earth, a place where entire chapters of human history lie waiting to be read by anyone patient enough and technologically equipped enough to look beneath the surface. What civilization left these traces? What knowledge did they possess? What became of them when the rain stopped and the lakes dried, and the world they knew was transformed into the world we know today? These questions drive our journey forward. They are the questions that each site we visit will reformulate, but never fully answer, because the answers, if they exist, lie buried deeper still, beneath layers of sand and silence and forgetting. The desert has preserved what it has swallowed. This is the paradox of the Sahara. The very aridity that destroyed the green phase cultures also protected their remains, sealing them beneath sediment, isolating them from the decay that would have consumed them in wetter environments. What we see exposed is a fraction of what exists. What we know is a fraction of what can be known. And what we can imagine is perhaps the smallest fraction of all, limited by assumptions we do not recognize as assumptions, by narratives we have absorbed so thoroughly we mistake them for obvious truths. The eye of the Sahara stares upward at the satellites that photograph it, concentric circles of ancient rock that may or may not align with cardinal directions, that may or may not show evidence of hydrothermal activity inconsistent with conventional geological models, that may or may not be something other than what mainstream science has concluded it must be. The foggara of the Garamantes thread through the darkness underground, engineered tunnels that supplied water to a civilization the classical world knew, but modern scholarship forgot, whose extent and achievements are only now being properly measured. The rock art of the wet Sahara preserves images of a world that rain and river made possible, a world of swimmers and fishermen and herders and beings whose forms suggest mysteries we cannot penetrate. Zazura waits beneath the sand, perhaps real, perhaps mythical, perhaps both, its white walls and sleeping guardians translated from legend into pixels by satellite instruments that see what human eyes cannot. Meroë's pyramids rise from the Sudanese desert, more than 250 monuments to a civilization whose connections to the vanished wet Sahara have barely begun to be explored. Tchit-Walata crumbles slowly on its cliff edges, stone walls witnessing the passage of millennia, evidence of urban life and agricultural innovation in a place that should have supported neither. And beneath Tadrat Carcass, LIDAR reveals shapes that may be nothing and may be everything, the first hints of discoveries that will transform our understanding or confirm our ignorance. The sand has swallowed much, but the sand is beginning to release its secrets. What emerges will depend on who looks, how they look, and what they are willing to see. This journey begins with questions, not answers. It begins with anomalies, not explanations. It begins with the recognition that what we think we know about the Sahara, about human history, about the development of civilization itself, may be incomplete in ways we are only starting to comprehend. Sit back. Let the images wash over you. Let the questions settle into your mind without demanding resolution. The desert is patient. It has held its secrets for thousands of years. It can wait a few hours more while we examine them one by one, site by site, mystery by mystery, following the traces of water across a land that has forgotten rain, listening for the whispers of civilizations that the sand has preserved and erased in equal measure. The earth remembers what we have forgotten. The stone holds testimony we're only now learning to read. And somewhere beneath the golden surface of the world's largest desert, beneath the dunes that shift and resettle with each passing wind, the remains of something waits. What that something is, we cannot yet say with certainty, but the evidence is accumulating. The questions are multiplying, and the answers, whatever they prove to be, will change the way we understand not only the Sahara but ourselves, our history, our place in a lineage of human achievement far older and stranger than we have dared to imagine. The Eye of the Sahara watches from the western reaches of Mauritania, a structure so vast that for decades it escaped notice entirely, invisible to those who walked its ridges because they could not perceive the pattern from within. 40 kilometers across, its concentric rings of sedimentary and igneous rock spiral outward from a central dome, creating a formation that early astronauts used as a landmark during orbital passes, a target they could recognize against the otherwise featureless expanse of sand and stone. The Risha structure, as geologists prefer to call it, sits on the Adrar Plateau at an elevation of roughly 400 meters above sea level, its blues and greys and rust browns etched into the landscape like the pupil of some impossibly ancient eye turned toward the heavens. From the ground, one perceives only ridges, valleys, cuestas of harder rock resisting the erosion that has worn away softer layers over spans of time measured in tens of millions of years. From the air, from space, from the detached perspective of satellite imagery, the shape reveals itself with a clarity that seems almost deliberate, almost designed, almost too perfect to be the product of blind geological process alone. Mainstream science has reached a consensus, or something approaching consensus, regarding the Risha structure's origins. The prevailing interpretation holds that it began as a dome, an upwelling of igneous rock that pushed overlying sedimentary layers upward without breaking through them, creating what geologists call a structural dome. Over immense stretches of time, erosion worked its slow artistry, stripping away softer rock while leaving harder formations intact, carving the concentric rings we observe today. The process required no cataclysm, no impact, no intervention beyond the patient collaboration of heat, pressure, water, and wind. The eye is an accident, a coincidence of differential weathering, a trick of erosion that produced a shape we find meaningful only because we are pattern-seeking creatures evolved to recognize faces and forms in random configurations. The colours are mineral, iron oxidation staining some layers rusty orange while others retain the pale blues and greys of their original composition. The circular form reflects the circular dome that once existed beneath, now exposed like a cross-section through deep time. Yet certain details invite deeper reflection, features that the geological explanation acknowledges without fully addressing. The structure's alignment, for instance, appears to follow cardinal directions with what some researchers describe as unusual precision, its major axes oriented north-south and east-west in ways that could be coincidental but seem curiously deliberate. The hydrothermal activity that accompanied the dome's formation left behind breccias, fragments of rock cemented together by mineral-rich water, flowing through fractures in the crust, and these breccias contain materials whose origins and temperatures of formation remain subjects of active investigation. Some analyses suggest temperatures far exceeding what conventional models would predict, heat signatures that hint at processes more complex than simple doming. The carbonatites present in the structure, rare ignite rocks formed from carbonate-rich magma, represent a geological phenomenon found in only a handful of locations worldwide, their presence here raising questions about what exactly occurred beneath this patch of African crust and when. The dating presents its own mysteries. The structure itself is ancient, formed perhaps 100 million years ago during the Cretaceous period, long before the Sahara existed in its current form, long before humans walked any part of Earth. Yet the erosion that revealed it, that carved the rings we see today, occurred much more recently in geological terms, shaped by water flows and climate conditions that no longer exist. During the wet phases of the Sahara, when seasonal rivers carved the wadis that now lie dry, when lakes filled basins currently buried under sand, the Richat structure would have looked different than it does today. Water would have pooled in its inner rings, flowed along channels between its ridges, supported vegetation and wildlife in a landscape now utterly hostile to life. Some researchers have wondered whether ancient peoples, walking this territory during the green phases, might have recognised the structure's unusual form, might have incorporated it into their understanding of sacred geography, might have left traces of their presence that erosion and sand have since erased. No definitive evidence of such habitation has emerged, no artefacts or rock art or settlement remains that would confirm human awareness of the eye during the deep past. But absence of evidence, as investigators often note, is not evidence of absence, particularly in a landscape where the sand buries and reveals and buries again with each shift of wind and climate. The more speculative theories, which mainstream geology dismisses with varying degrees of patience, propose alternative explanations for the Richat structure's formation. Some have suggested an impact origin, arguing that the concentric rings resemble the structure of an eroded impact crater, that the central dome could represent a rebound peak formed when asteroid-fractured rock sprang upward in the moments following collision. The geological evidence does not support this interpretation, lacking the shocked quartz and high-pressure mineral phases that typically characterize impact sites, yet the visual resemblance to impact craters remains striking enough to fuel continued speculation. Others have drawn connections to the mythological, noting that Plato's description of Atlantis includes concentric rings of land and water surrounding a central island, that the dimensions he provided could, with certain interpretations, correspond roughly to the Richat structure's scale, that the location in Western Africa aligns with some readings of Atlantis's placement beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Such theories exist at the fringes of scholarship, embraced by few academics but endlessly circulating in the corners of the internet where anomaly hunters gather to share their findings and suspicions. What cannot be denied is the structure's power as a symbol, as a focal point for the questions that the Sahara raises about deep time and human memory. Standing on one of its inner ridges, one feels the immensity of geological process, the slow accumulation of sediment that built these layers, the even slower erosion that stripped them away, the indifference of Earth to human concerns and human timescales. The eye looks upward at the sun, at the stars, at the satellites that photograph it, and it reveals nothing of its intentions because it has none. It is stone and mineral and deep time made visible, yet we cannot help but wonder, cannot help but project meaning onto its circles, cannot help but ask whether something in its form might point toward knowledge we have lost or never possessed. The Sahara keeps its secrets. The eye watches but does not speak, and the questions persist, circling like the rings themselves, drawing us inward toward a centre we cannot quite reach. Our journey shifts eastward now, crossing the vast emptiness of the central desert toward the Fezzan region of southwestern Libya, where another civilization left evidence of achievements that seemed impossible until archaeology rediscovered them. The Garamantes were not mythical, not legendary, not speculative. They appear in classical sources, mentioned by Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, described as a powerful people who hunted cave-dwelling Ethiopians in 4-horse chariots, who controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes that brought gold and slaves and exotic goods northward to the Mediterranean coast. The Romans knew them as troublesome neighbours, sometimes enemies, sometimes allies, always significant enough to warrant attention from the imperial administration in North Africa. Pliny the Elder wrote of their capital, Garama, as a prominent city, while Ptolemy mapped their territory with the approximate precision available to 2nd century geographers. They were real. They existed. The classical world acknowledged their presence and their power. Yet for centuries after Rome's fall, the Garamantes receded into obscurity, their achievements forgotten, their cities swallowed by the advancing desert, their very existence questioned by scholars who could not imagine how a significant civilization could have flourished in one of Earth's most hostile environments. The Fezzan seemed too barren, too waterless, too extreme to support any settlement beyond scattered oases, let alone the elaborate urban culture that ancient sources implied. Archaeological work in the 20th century began to change this perception, slowly at first, then with accelerating revelations as technology improved and access expanded. What emerged from the sand defied expectations. The Garamantes had not merely survived in the desert, they had thrived, building a civilization whose engineering achievements rivaled those of far more famous cultures, whose population at its peak numbered in the hundreds of thousands, whose territory stretched across an area the size of a small European nation. The key to their success lay underground, in a network of subterranean channels called foggaras, irrigation tunnels that tapped aquifers beneath the desert surface and carried water by gravity flow to agricultural fields and settlements. The principle was not unique to the Garamantes, appearing independently in Persia as qanats, in Oman as aflaj, in various forms across the arid world wherever human ingenuity confronted water scarcity. But the Garamantean system achieved a scale and sophistication that recent surveys have revealed to be staggering. Over 1,000 foggaras have been identified, their combined length exceeding an estimated 1,600 kilometres, channels cut through living rock at depths reaching 30 metres, maintained and extended over centuries of continuous use. The labour required to construct this network defies casual comprehension. Each tunnel had to be excavated from vertical shafts spaced along its length, workers descending into darkness to chip away at stone with tools of iron and bronze, removing spoil by basket and rope, gradually extending the horizontal channel toward the water table while ensuring proper gradient for flow. The construction demanded precise surveying, requiring measurements that would determine whether water actually reached its destination or pooled uselessly underground. The maintenance demanded constant vigilance, as tunnel collapses and sediment accumulation could block flow and starve downstream settlements. Modern researchers, using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating surveys, have mapped the extent of this hydraulic empire with increasing precision. The numbers continue to grow as technology improves and fieldwork expands. Settlements that appeared isolated turn out to be connected by underground channels. Agricultural areas that seemed impossible to irrigate prove to have been watered by tunnels long since collapsed and forgotten. The Garamantes transformed their territory from desert to garden, supporting populations that classical sources hint at, but modern archaeology is only now confirming. Garama itself, the capital, covered an area of several square kilometres. Its mud brick buildings rising from the desert floor in forms that aerial photography has revealed but ground excavation has only partially explored. Surrounding it, satellite cemeteries containing tens of thousands of burials suggest the scale of the population that lived and died under Garamantean rule. The graves contain goods that speak of trade connections extending thousands of kilometres, beads of Egyptian faience, glass from the Mediterranean, objects whose presence this deep in the Sahara testifies to networks of exchange that crossed the desert when water made such crossing possible. The chronology of the Garamantes spans roughly a millennium, from approximately 1000 BCE to the 5th or 6th century CE, their rise coinciding with the development of iron technology, and their decline coinciding with the final exhaustion of the fossil water that fed their foggaras. For this is the bitter irony of their achievement. The aquifers they tapped were not renewable, not replenished by the meagre rainfall of the historical Sahara, but rather remnants of the wet phases, water that had accumulated during the green millennia and remained trapped underground as the surface dried. Each litre the Garamantes drew was a litre that would not return. Each field they irrigated depleted a resource that required tens of thousands of years to accumulate. They were mining water, extracting it on timescales incompatible with natural recharge, and eventually the mines ran dry. The foggaras that archaeology traces across the Libyan desert are monuments to a civilization that consumed its own foundation, that built brilliance on a resource it could not renew, that vanished not because of conquest or catastrophe, but because the water simply ceased to flow. What knowledge vanished with them? The engineering skill to survey and construct foggaras across such distances, to calculate grades and flow rates and aquifer depths with tools of wood and rope and human observation, represents a technical tradition that accumulated over generations, refined through trial and error, transmitted through methods we cannot reconstruct from the silent tunnels alone. The Garamantes left no written records, or none that have survived, their language and their thoughts lost with the water that sustained them. We have their graves, their walls, their channels cut through stone, but we do not have their voices, their explanations, their understanding of what they had built and why. Mainstream archaeology interprets their achievement as an impressive but comprehensible application of known hydraulic principles, scaled up through centuries of development by a people whose success bred population growth that required ever more water, that required ever more tunnels in a spiral that could end only one way. Yet certain aspects continue to invite deeper reflection. The speed of the system's development during certain periods suggests knowledge transfer or innovation bursts that the gradual accumulation model does not fully explain. The sophistication of some tunnel, junctions and distribution systems implies engineering understanding that seems to exceed what trial and error alone would produce in the available time. The possibility of earlier precedents, a foggara technology inherited from wet phase civilizations whose traces the Garamantes built upon, cannot be entirely excluded given how much remains unexcavated, how much lies beneath sands that have shifted and resettled over 20 centuries. Were the Garamantes the originators of their hydraulic system? Or were they the inheritors, the maintainers, the final practitioners of knowledge that stretched back to the Green Sahara? Did the techniques they employed emerge independently in their territory, or were they transmitted from elsewhere, from earlier experiments in water management whose evidence the desert has erased? The tunnels cannot answer. They extend through darkness, carrying no water now, their stone walls testifying to labour and skill, but not to the minds that directed them. The connection to the wet Sahara becomes most vivid when we consider what the land looked like when the first foggaras were being dug. Though the green phase had ended millennia before the Garamantes rose to prominence, the transition was not instantaneous. Intermediate periods of higher rainfall, brief returns of wetter conditions, may have provided windows during which settlement patterns established during more favourable times could be maintained and extended. The fossil water the Garamantes tapped was wet Sahara water, precipitation that fell when the eye of the Risha overlooked rivers, and the rock art painters followed herds across grassland. By drilling down to reach it, the Garamantes were touching the past, drinking from lakes that had evaporated thousands of years before, irrigating their fields with the ghost of a climate that no longer existed. Every foggara was a kind of time machine, bridging the gap between the Green Sahara and the Yellow, allowing civilization to persist in lands where the surface conditions should have made it impossible. The rock art of the Sahara provides the most direct window into that lost green world, images preserved on stone surfaces across millions of square kilometres, painted and carved by peoples whose names we will never know, whose languages left no other trace, whose entire existence is recorded only in the pictures they made. The distribution of this art follows the logic of ancient water. Where rivers once flowed, rock surfaces bear witness to the people who lived along their banks. Where lakes once spread, the cliffs that overlooked them preserve records of the animals that drank and the hunters who pursued them. The density is staggering. Individual sites contain thousands of figures, and sites number in the tens of thousands across the broader Saharan region. No comprehensive catalogue exists. No inventory has approached completeness. Each year, researchers document previously unknown panels, previously unseen images, evidence of artistic production on a scale that defies easy comprehension. The chronology of Saharan rock art stretches across the entire span of the wet phases and beyond, from Paleolithic images that may predate the last glacial maximum to pastoral scenes from the terminal green phase just 5,000 years ago. The Roundhead period, named for the stylized human figures with circular, featureless faces, may extend as far back as 10,000 years, its images populated by beings whose interpretation divides scholars. Some see masked figures, humans wearing ceremonial headgear that enlarged and abstracted their features. Others see representations of trance states, the altered perceptions of shamanic experience translated into visual form. Still others see something else entirely, beings whose forms suggest that the artists were depicting encounters or entities that do not fit comfortably into any conventional category. The figures float, arms upraised, across rock surfaces darkened by millennia of desert varnish, their meaning as opaque to us as the minds that conceived them. The swimming scenes remain among the most striking of all Saharan rock art, images of human figures in postures that clearly represent swimming, diving, floating in water that no longer exists within thousands of kilometres. They appear at Wadi Sura in the Egyptian portion of the Sahara, at sites across Libya and Algeria and Niger, evidence of a landscape where water was abundant enough that swimming became a subject worth commemorating in permanent form. The swimmers twist and turn, arms extended, bodies horizontal, captured in moments of aquatic grace that seem impossibly foreign to the landscapes where they now appear. Surrounding them, other figures engage in activities equally dependent on the vanished water, fishing, boating, interacting with aquatic animals whose descendants now survive only in distant rivers far beyond the Saharan margins. The art does not merely document, it celebrates. It records a relationship with water so central to daily life that it warranted inscription on stone for purposes that must have included commemoration, instruction, ritual, or simply the human urge to create. The pastoral period that followed the Roundheads brought images of cattle in such abundance that some scholars speak of a cattle cult, a religious or cultural complex centered on the animals that made Saharan life possible during the later wet phases. The herds processed across cliff faces in their hundreds, their thousands, stylized forms repeated with variations that suggest both artistic convention and individual observation. The cattle are not uniform. They display different horn shapes, different body proportions, different colorations rendered through pigments that have survived millennia of exposure. They appear in scenes of herding, milking, what might be sacrifice or might be slaughter, or might be ritual activities whose nature we cannot determine from images alone. The people who tended them appear alongside, smaller figures dwarfed by the cattle that were clearly the focus of representation, their postures suggesting activities connected to pastoral life, their occasional details of dress or adornment hinting at cultural complexity that the archaeological record otherwise fails to preserve. And then the cattle vanished. The herds that once processed across these landscapes in their tens of thousands, their hundreds of thousands, disappeared from the rock art record as surely as they disappeared from the land itself. The final images show something different, something that speaks to the transformation that overtook this world. Horse-drawn chariots appear, racing across stone surfaces that had known only cattle and their keepers for millennia. The chariots suggest speed, movement, a world in transition where the slow rhythms of pastoral life gave way to something more urgent. They follow routes across the Sahara that some researchers have mapped, theoretical paths connecting the Mediterranean coast to the Niger Bend, corridors of passage through a landscape that was becoming increasingly hostile to human habitation. The chariot images yield in turn to camels, the final artistic phase before the Great Silence descended, before the rock art tradition that had persisted for perhaps 10,000 years came to its end. The camel images are fewer, rougher, the work of people who no longer possessed the leisure or the inclination to cover cliff faces with elaborate scenes of abundance. They mark the threshold between the Green Sahara and the Sahara we know today, the Sahara that swallowed everything that came before and kept its secrets beneath the sand. The Tassili Niger alone contains an estimated 15,000 rock art sites. The number staggers the imagination. 15,000 locations where ancient artists left their marks, and this in just one portion of a mountain range that itself represents just one region of the Greater Saharan Expanse. Multiply outward, across the Akarkas in Libya, across the Enedi in Chad, across the Air Mountains of Niger, across hundreds of smaller massifs and wadis and rock outcrops, scattered throughout 5 million square miles of desert, and the scale of what was lost, what remains hidden, what awaits discovery, becomes almost impossible to comprehend. Each site that researchers have studied in detail has proven to contain more than initial surveys suggested. Panels that appeared to hold dozens of figures reveal hundreds under careful examination. Surfaces that seemed blank yield images when viewed under particular lighting conditions. Their pigments faded but still present, their outlines still traceable by those who know how to look. The art hides in plain sight, waiting for eyes trained to perceive it, and beneath the sand that has drifted against cliff faces and filled the mouths of shelters, more surely remains, protected from the erosion and weathering that has degraded exposed surfaces over the millennia. What does it mean that people painted and engraved on this scale, in this place, across this span of time? The question carries implications that extend far beyond art history. To produce rock art in such quantities requires population substantial enough to support specialised artists, or at minimum cultures that valued artistic production highly enough that individuals devoted significant time to creation rather than subsistence. It requires social continuity, traditions transmitted across generations, techniques and conventions passed from teacher to student over centuries and millennia. It requires, in short, civilization, though not necessarily civilization as we have been taught to recognize it. Not cities, perhaps. Not monumental architecture in the Egyptian or Mesopotamian mode, but organized societies, complex cultures, peoples whose lives encompassed far more than the desperate struggle for survival. The rock art speaks of leisure, of spiritual practice, of aesthetic sensibility, of a relationship with the land so intimate and so sustained that recording it on stone became a central cultural activity. What else did these people build, create, organize, that the stone did not preserve and the sand has swallowed? From the galleries of the Green Sahara, let us move now to consider what may be the most enigmatic landscape feature in all of Africa, a formation so strange that its very existence seems to challenge explanation. Our journey takes us to Mauritania, to the western reaches of the Saharan expanse, where something waits in the sand that astronauts first noticed from orbit, and that scientists have studied for decades without reaching consensus on its nature or its origin. The Richa structure appears on satellite imagery as a vast bullseye inscribed on the face of the Earth, a series of concentric rings stretching 40 kilometers across, its nested circles so perfectly geometric that they seem more the product of deliberate design than natural process. The local name captures something of its appearance from above, though the feature was invisible as a unified whole until humanity achieved the perspective of orbital altitude. From the ground, one sees only the rings themselves, ridges of resistant rock alternating with valleys of softer stone, a landscape of curved escarpments and circular depressions that reveal their true pattern only from the sky. The structure sits in the Adrar Plateau, a region of dramatic mesas and deep canyons carved into the ancient sandstones that underlie this portion of the Sahara. The plateau itself rises from the surrounding desert, an island of elevated terrain whose edges drop away in cliffs and slopes that separate it from the lower lands beyond. Within this already remarkable landscape, the Richat structure represents an anomaly within an anomaly, a circular form imposed upon horizontal strata, a pattern that draws the eye and demands explanation from anyone who encounters it. The rings comprise ridges of quartzite and other resistant lithologies, alternating with softer limestones and siltstones that have eroded more deeply, creating the visual contrast that makes the structure so striking from above. The central portion, at the bullseye's heart, exposes rocks that differ from those of the surrounding rings, igneous and metamorphic lithologies that hint at processes quite different from the sedimentary deposition that formed most of the regional geology. Early speculation focused on impact. The circular form, the central uplift, the raised rim, all suggested the possibility that a meteorite or asteroid had struck here in the distant past, its violence creating a crater that subsequent erosion modified into its current appearance. Impact craters dot the Earth's surface, from the small and recent to giants like Vredefort in South Africa, whose 200-kilometer diameter makes it the largest confirmed impact structure on the planet. The Richat structure, at 40 kilometers, would fall well within the size range of known impact features, and its location in a remote desert region would explain why such a large structure might have escaped earlier detection. For years, the impact hypothesis dominated discussion, its elegant simplicity explaining the circular form in terms of a violent cosmic event whose energy would have been sufficient to create exactly such a feature. Yet detailed study has complicated this straightforward explanation. The evidence that normally confirms impact origin, the signature traces that cosmic violence leaves in terrestrial rock, has proven remarkably elusive at Richat. Shatter cones, the distinctive striated fracture patterns that high-pressure shockwaves produce in rock, have not been found. Planar deformation features in quartz grains, another diagnostic indicator of impact shock, are absent. High-pressure mineral phases that form only under the extreme conditions of cosmic collision do not appear in the structure's rocks. The melt rocks that impact events typically produce, the solidified remnants of material heated to the point of liquefaction by the energy of collision, have not been identified. Crater by crater, feature by feature, researchers have found confirmation of impact at sites around the world, the physical evidence complementing the geometric form to establish beyond reasonable doubt that a cosmic projectile struck at that location. At Riche, the geometry suggests impact, but the physical evidence refuses to confirm it. The current scientific consensus favours a different explanation, one rooted in terrestrial rather than cosmic processes. The Riche structure, most geologists now believe, represents a deeply eroded dome, an uplift formed when magma pushed upward from below but never broke through to the surface. The concentric rings reflect the differential erosion of rock layers that were warped upward by this intrusion, harder layers forming ridges while softer layers weathered into valleys, the entire pattern revealed over time as erosion stripped away the overlying material. The igneous rocks at the centre represent the frozen remnant of the magmatic body itself, the engine of uplift now exposed at the surface. The process, while dramatic, falls within the understood range of geological phenomena, requiring no cosmic intervention, no impact from beyond Earth, only the ordinary extraordinary processes that shape our planet's surface over geological time. And yet, the structure's near-perfect circularity, its precisely nested rings, the remarkable symmetry visible from orbital altitude, these features continue to inspire questions that the geological explanation does not entirely satisfy. Erosion typically produces irregular forms, landscapes sculpted by the particulars of rock strength and water flow and slope angle, each outcrop unique. The Riche structure displays a regularity that seems almost crystalline, almost designed, its circles maintaining their geometry across 40 kilometers of terrain. The official answer may be correct, probably is correct by any standard assessment of evidence and probability. But the structure's appearance, its location in a desert that has preserved so many ancient mysteries, its visibility only from perspectives that ancient people could never have achieved, these elements combine to create an aura of the unexplained that no geological explanation can entirely dispel. Some have noted the structure's similarity to descriptions in ancient texts, its concentric rings echoing legendary cities whose layouts followed circular plans. The comparison is speculative, probably coincidental, certainly unprovable. Yet the Riche structure occupies a position on the map that has attracted attention from those who seek to reconcile ancient accounts with physical features that satellite imagery has only recently revealed. The coordinates align interestingly with certain interpretations of certain passages, though such alignments can be constructed after the fact with almost any sufficiently prominent feature. What cannot be denied is that something unusual happened here, something that produced a formation unlike almost any other on Earth's surface, something that remains not quite fully explained despite decades of study and the official geological consensus. Directly east, across the immensity of the Sahara, across Libya and into Sudan, our journey encounters monuments of a different order, structures whose human origin is beyond question, but whose scale and sophistication challenge conventional narratives of African civilization. The pyramids of Meroë rise from the Sudanese desert, their forms unmistakable, yet distinctly different from their more famous counterparts further north. They are smaller than the Egyptian giants, steeper in angle, more numerous in their clustering. Approximately 200 pyramids stand in the various Nubian pyramid fields, concentrated near Meroë and at older sites like Nuri and El Kuru, a collection that outnumbers the Egyptian pyramids by a substantial margin, though it receives a fraction of the attention. The Kingdom of Kush, which built these monuments, persisted for over 1,000 years, from approximately 1070 BCE to 350 CE, a longevity that exceeds most ancient civilizations yet remains surprisingly obscure in popular understanding of the ancient world. The relationship between Kush and Egypt fluctuated across these centuries, periods of domination alternating with independence, cultural exchange flowing in both directions, though traditional narratives have emphasized Egyptian influence on Kush rather than the reverse. For one remarkable century, the 25th dynasty, Kushite kings ruled Egypt itself, a Nubian dynasty on the throne of the pharaohs, their monuments standing at Karnak and Thebes alongside those of their predecessors. The period ended with Assyrian conquest, but the Kushite kingdom withdrew southward rather than dissolving, recentering at Meroë where it would flourish for another 8 centuries before its final decline. The pyramids at Meroë date primarily from this later period, tombs of kings and queens and nobles whose names survive in inscriptions that scholars can partially read but not fully understand, the Meroitic language remaining one of antiquity's great undeciphered mysteries. The construction techniques at Meroë reflect both Egyptian heritage and local innovation. The characteristic steep angle, approximately 70 degrees compared to the 52 degrees typical of Egyptian pyramids, represents a deliberate divergence from the northern model, a choice whose motivation scholars debate. The steeper angle required different engineering solutions, different approaches to internal structure, different relationships between base area and height. The builders worked primarily in sandstone quarried from nearby sources, though some pyramids incorporate other materials, their core construction varying in sophistication from careful stone laying to rubble, fill-faced with dressed blocks. The decorative programs of the chapels attached to each pyramid follow Egyptian conventions while incorporating Meroitic iconography and religious elements, hybrid forms that speak to a culture confident enough to adopt foreign elements while adapting them to local purposes. The queens of Meroë, the Kandakes, ruled in their own right with a frequency unusual in the ancient world, their pyramids standing alongside those of kings, their power apparently co-equal in certain periods. Roman sources record a one-eyed queen who led armies against Augustus's forces, her fierce resistance earning respect even from enemies. The title Kandake itself passed into Greek and Latin as the name Candace, becoming a proper name that persists into the present, a trace of Meroitic civilization surviving in forms that those who bear the name rarely recognize. The society that supported these rulers, that built these monuments, that maintained a literate civilization in the Upper Nile for over a millennium, this society remains poorly understood by comparison with Egypt or the classical Mediterranean world. The script is partially readable, the sounds known but the language itself still opaque. Meroitic inscriptions reveal names, titles, offerings to gods, but the deeper structures of grammar and meaning resist penetration. When the kingdom finally fell, in the 4th century CE, its literacy vanished with it, leaving monuments whose inscriptions we can pronounce but cannot comprehend. The desert that surrounds these pyramids has both preserved and concealed them. Sand dunes drift against their bases, periodically covering and uncovering the lower courses. Occasional floods from the Nile, whose seasonal rhythms reach even this far into the desert, have deposited silt that archaeological excavations must penetrate to reach original surfaces. The 19th century brought European attention and, with it, destruction on a scale that remains controversial. Italian treasure hunter Giuseppe Fellini demolished the tops of dozens of pyramids in his search for burial goods, finding treasure in one and destroying many others in his fruitless search for more. The decapitated forms of many Meroë pyramids date to this single episode of destruction, their original pointed caps lost to the greed of a single man whose name is now forever linked with cultural vandalism. What treasures he destroyed in his searching, what information he obliterated, remains incalculable. Recent investigations have revealed structures at Meroë that extend far beyond the visible pyramid fields. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite analysis have identified buried features beneath the desert surface, outlines of buildings and walls and enclosures that never reached the attention of earlier explorers. The city that supported the pyramid complex, the capital of a 1,000-year kingdom, extends beneath the sand in ways that surface surveys never suggested. Each excavation season reveals new features, new structures, new evidence of a civilization more extensive and more sophisticated than the visible monuments alone would indicate. The desert preserved what was buried and obscured the scale of what existed, creating an impression of the kingdom that reflects preservation bias rather than historical reality. Meroë was a major city by any standard, a centre of iron production, of trade, of political power, its influence extending across a vast territory that conventional maps of the ancient world tend to minimise or ignore. The iron production at Meroë particularly warrants attention. Massive slag heaps surround the city, the waste product of smelting operations that processed local iron ore on an industrial scale. The heaps contain enough material to suggest production quantities that would have been significant by any ancient standard, iron output that could have equipped armies, supplied tools, supported trade. The furnaces that produced this iron are only partially understood, their technology reconstructed from archaeological remnants and comparison with traditional African ironworking techniques that may preserve ancient methods. Some scholars have proposed that Meroë served as a crucial node in the diffusion of iron technology across Africa, its products and its knowledge spreading south and west to influence metallurgical traditions across the continent. The proposal remains debated, alternative models suggesting independent invention in multiple regions, but the scale of Meroë's iron industry is beyond dispute. This was an industrial centre as well as a royal capital, a city whose power rested on practical production as well as divine kingship. What connections linked Meroë to the wider ancient world? Trade goods found in Meroitic contexts include Mediterranean products, Indian Ocean products, goods that travelled along routes extending thousands of kilometres in multiple directions. Meroë sat at a crossroads, the Nile providing water connection to the Mediterranean while overland routes reached eastward to the Red Sea coast and southward into the African interior. The kingdom's longevity suggests successful exploitation of this strategic position, political stability sufficient to maintain trade networks across centuries of Mediterranean upheaval. When Rome expanded into Egypt, Meroë adapted, sometimes conflicting, sometimes cooperating, maintaining its independence while engaging with the superpower to its north. The one-eyed queen who fought Augustus negotiated a treaty remarkably favourable to her kingdom, suggesting diplomatic sophistication equal to military resolve, and yet Meroë declined, and Meroë fell, and the reasons remain unclear. The 4th century CE brought crisis to the kingdom, external pressures from the expanding Aksumite kingdom to the east, perhaps internal stresses that our sources do not record. The pyramids ceased to be built. The inscriptions fell silent. The last traces of Meroitic civilization disappear from the record, and when later travellers passed through the region, they found only monuments whose makers they could not identify and whose inscriptions they could not read. The desert reclaimed what the kingdom had built, sand drifting across palace floors and into temple sanctuaries, obscuring the evidence of centuries of civilization. What documents might have recorded Meroë's history rotted in the humid earth or crumbled to dust in the desert wind. What oral traditions might have preserved memory of the kingdom diffused and altered, and eventually lost as populations moved and mixed and forgot. By the time European archaeology turned its attention to Sudan, Meroë had become a mystery, its monuments impressive but mute, its history largely inaccessible. The buried pyramids that satellite imagery has detected represent only the most visible of the Sudanese mysteries that modern technology continues to reveal. Across the region, remote sensing has identified anomalies that suggest structures concealed beneath sand and soil, features too regular to be natural, too large to investigate through traditional excavation methods. The cost of archaeology in remote desert regions remains prohibitive, each season of work requiring extensive logistical support, each site requiring years to excavate properly, each excavation raising more questions than it answers. The inventory of known sites far exceeds the capacity of existing research programs to study them. The inventory of suspected sites, anomalies detected but not investigated, features visible from space but never examined on the ground, this inventory grows faster than the known sites can be addressed. We are discovering more than we can study, identifying more than we can excavate, creating a backlog of mysteries that future generations will inherit. The Sahara keeps its secrets in layers, and beneath the sands of what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali lies evidence of another complexity the desert has chosen to conceal. The Tichit Walata tradition, as archaeologists have come to call it, represents one of the earliest known examples of settled agricultural life in West Africa, a cultural sequence spanning roughly 2,000 years during which populations adapted to changing conditions with remarkable ingenuity, building in stone, cultivating millet, herding cattle, and eventually dispersing when the climate shifted beyond what adaptation could accommodate. The name derives from modern settlements in the region, Tichit and Walata, towns that today exist at the edge of habitability, places where rainfall barely sustains life and the desert presses close on every side. Yet 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, this landscape looked different. Hosted populations measured in the tens of thousands, supported economies based on cultivation and pastoralism, gave rise to architectural traditions whose remains still mark the ground despite centuries of erosion and neglect. The stone ruins that dot the Tagant and Hod regions of Mauritania represent only the most durable traces of this vanished world, foundations and walls and enclosures that once formed parts of settlements stretching across hundreds of square kilometres. The timing of this cultural fluorescence coincides with the final stages of the wet Sahara, the terminal green phase before the hyper-arid conditions of the past several millennia fully established themselves. The early inhabitants of the Tikrit region inherited a landscape already drying, lakes shrinking, grasslands retreating, but not yet the forbidding desert that would eventually prevail. They adapted to increasing aridity by developing agricultural strategies centered on pearl millet, one of the first domestications of this crucial grain, transforming wild grasses into cultivated crops through selection processes that accumulated over generations. The evidence for this early millet cultivation appears in archaeological deposits dating to roughly 2000 BCE, making the Tikrit region one of the earliest known centers of African agricultural innovation, a place where the techniques that would eventually feed much of the continent first took recognizable form. The mainstream interpretation emphasizes local development, indigenous innovation, populations responding to environmental pressure by intensifying food production, techniques spreading through population movement and cultural contact to influence agricultural traditions across the Sahel and beyond. The archaeological sequence supports this reading, each phase of the Tikrit tradition showing continuity with what preceded, while incorporating innovations that allowed populations to persist as conditions grew more challenging. Yet the sophistication of the earliest phases raises questions that straightforward developmental narratives do not fully address. The stone constructions appear with remarkable completeness, walls built with care and regularity, settlements organized according to apparent planning principles, architectural traditions that suggest accumulated experience rather than tentative experimentation. Where did this building knowledge come from? What preceded the earliest phases of the Tikrit sequence? The archaeological record offers glimpses of earlier occupation, traces of populations that inhabited the region before the stone-building tradition crystallized. But these earlier phases remain poorly understood, their deposits shallow and scattered, their evidence fragmentary at best. The transition from mobile hunting and gathering to settled agricultural life with substantial architecture typically occurs gradually. The archaeological record of most regions showing intermediate phases, false starts, settlements that were occupied briefly and abandoned, experiments that did not persist. The Tikrit record seems compressed, the transition more rapid than one might expect, unless earlier phases lie undetected beneath later deposits or in areas not yet investigated. The inventory of the unknown expands whenever we examine the evidence closely. The layout of Tikrit settlements itself raises questions about social organization and political complexity. Some sites are large, many hectares in extent, their ruins suggesting populations that must have required coordination to sustain. The positioning of settlements across the landscape suggests deliberate planning, sites located to exploit water sources, overlooking agricultural land connected by routes that facilitated movement and exchange. Later phases show evidence of what archaeologists interpret as defensive architecture, walls positioned to control access, settlements clustered in ways that suggest concern with security. What threats required such defenses? Competing groups within the same cultural tradition, raiders from beyond the region, pressures related to the worsening climate, conflicts over shrinking resources. The standard interpretation invokes increasing aridity, driving population movement and competition, groups that had previously coexisted peacefully now struggling for access to dwindling water and cultivable land. The narrative fits the evidence, but evidence remains limited. Our reconstruction of Tikrit social dynamics, based on inferences from architectural remains and artifact distributions rather than documentary sources that might record intentions and events directly. The millet cultivation that formed the economic foundation of Tikrit life represents one of Africa's most significant contributions to global agriculture, a domestication process whose results eventually spread across thousands of kilometers, sustaining populations throughout the Sahel, reaching India and Southeast Asia, becoming a staple crop for communities scattered across the tropical and subtropical world. The wild ancestors of cultivated pearl millet grew in the regions where the Tikrit tradition developed, grasses that produced edible seeds, but required human intervention to become reliable crops. The selection pressures that transformed these wild grasses into domesticated cereals operated over many generations, people choosing seeds from plants with favourable characteristics, cultivating them in conditions that favoured further development, gradually accumulating genetic changes that made the plants more productive and more dependent on human care. This process of domestication ranks among humanity's most consequential achievements, the foundation upon which sedentary civilization everywhere ultimately rests. That it occurred here, in this now desert region, during the final flourishing before the hyper-arid phase, suggests the pressure of necessity driving innovation, populations adapting to changing conditions by intensifying their engagement with the plant resources available to them. But the timeline presents puzzles that simple necessity does not entirely explain. The earliest cultivated millet appears archaeologically around 2500 to 2000 BCE, yet this is already recognisably domesticated, distinct from wild forms in ways that imply generations of prior selection. The wild-to-domestic transition itself remains archaeologically invisible, either because it occurred in regions not yet investigated, because earlier deposits have been destroyed by erosion, or buried beyond reach, or because the process happened faster than current models predict. Some researchers have proposed that domestication could have occurred rapidly, single mutations conferring dramatic changes in plant morphology, favourable variants spreading quickly once they appeared. Others suggest that we are simply missing earlier phases, that the evidence for initial domestication lies somewhere in the vast unexcavated reaches of the Sahara or Sahel, waiting for future archaeologists with different resources and different questions. The gap between wild forms and the earliest documented domesticates invites speculation, and speculation in this region tends toward the same themes that recur throughout our journey. The possibility that more happened earlier than current evidence reveals, that the desert has concealed as much as it has preserved. The dispersal of Tichit populations coincides with the intensification of arid conditions during the first millennium BCE, people moving away from regions that could no longer support them, carrying with them the agricultural knowledge and cultural traditions they had developed over centuries of settled life. Some scholars trace connections between the Tichit diaspora and the formation of later West African societies, suggesting that populations displaced from the drying Sahara contributed to the development of complex societies farther south, bringing agricultural techniques and organisational knowledge to new regions. The Ghana Empire, the earliest of the major Sudanic kingdoms documented in Arabic sources, arose in territories not far from the former Tichit heartland, and some researchers have proposed continuities linking the dispersed Tichit populations to the founding of these later states. The proposal remains speculative. The gap between the archaeological Tichit sequence and the historically documented kingdoms measured in centuries if not millennia, but the geographical proximity and the agricultural foundations seem suggestive. Did the knowledge that enabled state formation in the Western Sahel derive ultimately from traditions developed during the wet Sahara, carried southward by populations fleeing the encroaching desert? The question cannot be answered definitively with current evidence, but it frames the Tichit tradition not as an isolated local phenomenon, but as a potential link in a longer chain of cultural transmission extending across millennia. The preservation of Tichit sites depends on factors that are themselves artifacts of the climate shift. Stone foundations endure where mud brick would have dissolved, outlines remaining visible on the surface thousands of years after abandonment, because the aridity that drove populations away also prevented the decay that would have obscured the evidence. Walking among these ruins today, one crosses ground that once supported bustling settlements, granaries filled with millet, pens enclosing cattle, dwellings where generations were born and died within walls now reduced to low courses barely rising above the sand. The silence of these places belies their former vitality, the stillness of the desert concealing a past of activity and life that the monuments alone cannot fully reconstruct. What songs were sung in these courtyards? What stories told during the long, dry season nights? What fears haunted populations watching their world grow steadily less hospitable? The stone foundations preserve structure but not meaning, layout but not life, the skeleton of a society whose flesh has long since vanished. Satellite imagery has transformed our understanding of the Tichit phenomenon scale, revealing settlement patterns that ground survey alone could never have documented. Viewed from space, the distribution of archaeological sites across the region becomes visible as a system, settlements connected by apparent pathways, positioned relative to terrain features and water sources in ways that suggest intentional organisation across large areas. The number of sites identified through remote sensing far exceeds those that have been investigated on the ground, the inventory of known locations growing even as resources for excavation remain limited. Each new image raises new questions, each identified anomaly representing another location that might yield evidence if examined, but that must remain terra incognita until circumstances permit investigation. The technology that allows us to see more also forces us to acknowledge how much remains unknown, how many mysteries the Teach-It region alone contains, without considering the broader reaches of the Sahara, where similar traditions might await discovery. Our journey now turns toward the Tadrat Akarkas, a sandstone massif rising in southwestern Libya near the border with Algeria, a landscape of wind-carved rocks and narrow canyons where prehistoric artists left some of the most extensive and well-preserved records of ancient Saharan life found anywhere. The Akarkas has been known to researchers for over a century, its rock art documented by Italian expeditions, studied by archaeologists from multiple nations, inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage List as testimony to the cultural achievements of Saharan peoples during the wet phases. The paintings and engravings span millennia, depicting the environmental and cultural changes that transformed the region from humid savanna to hyper-arid desert, recording in images what written sources nowhere describe. Early representations show hippopotamuses, crocodiles, fish, creatures that require permanent water, testimony to lakes and rivers that have entirely vanished. Later phases depict cattle, pastoralist scenes, populations that had adapted to drier conditions while still finding the region habitable. Later still come horses, then camels, the imagery tracking the technological transitions that allowed people to continue using the region as water grew scarcer. The final phases show barely anything at all, the last artist departing as conditions became truly inhospitable, leaving their galleries to the wind and sand that have both preserved and slowly eroded them ever since. The mainstream interpretation of Akarkas rock art emphasizes its documentary value, treating the images as records of what the artists observed, evidence for environmental conditions and cultural practices that other sources do not preserve. The cattle depicted in pastoral scenes belong to herds that actually grazed in the now dry wadis. The human figures engaged in activities that formed part of daily life. The animals shown inhabited the landscape when the images were made. This reading treats the art as essentially descriptive, its value lying in the information it conveys about the past, rather than in any symbolic or spiritual dimensions that might also have motivated its creation. Alternative interpretations emphasize the ritual contexts in which rock art was often produced, suggesting that the images served purposes beyond simple documentation, that their placement and execution connected to beliefs and practices we can only partially reconstruct. The debate over meaning accompanies rock art studies worldwide, the images themselves remaining mute on questions of intention and significance that modern viewers cannot help but ask. Yet recent investigations using technologies unavailable to earlier researchers have begun to reveal complexities in the Akarkas record that neither purely documentary nor purely ritual interpretations fully accommodate. Light detection and ranging surveys, the same LiDAR technology that has revolutionized archaeology in forested regions, proves useful even in desert environments, detecting subtle terrain variations invisible to conventional survey, identifying features concealed beneath shallow sand cover, mapping the three-dimensional structure of rock shelters and canyon systems with precision impossible through other methods. The results have identified features that earlier researchers overlooked or could not see, traces of human presence that extend the record in unexpected directions, relationships between art sites and other archaeological features that suggest patterned use of the landscape. What emerges is a picture more complex than earlier surveys recognized. The Akarkas functioning not simply as a gallery of prehistoric art, but as a structured landscape whose organization reflected social and perhaps cosmological principles whose nature we can only glimpse. One category of discovery concerns the dwelling sites associated with rock art locations. Earlier research focused on the art itself, documenting the images while paying less attention to the spaces around and beneath them. LiDAR survey and follow-up investigation have revealed that many art sites overlie or sit adjacent to occupation deposits, the same locations serving both as living spaces and as canvases for artistic expression across extended periods. The stratigraphy of some sites records repeated episodes of occupation spanning centuries or millennia, populations returning to the same locations generation after generation, adding new images to accumulating galleries, depositing artifacts and organic materials that build up into archaeological sequences of considerable depth. The relationship between dwelling and art suggests that image making was not a specialised activity restricted to particular locations, but an integral part of inhabiting the landscape, marks accumulating wherever people lived and worked and returned. The sites that preserve the richest art also tend to preserve the richest occupation evidence, a correlation suggesting that the two activities were linked rather than separate. The LiDAR data has also revealed features that have no obvious relationship to the rock art at all, structures and modifications that suggest activities beyond dwelling and image making. Stone alignments appear in some canyon systems, arrangements too regular to be natural, their purpose unclear from remote sensing data alone. Cleared areas and leveled platforms suggest deliberate landscape modification, efforts to create spaces suitable for activities that required preparation and planning. Water management features, possible channels and catchment basins, hint at efforts to exploit seasonal rainfall and occasional flood events, techniques for concentrating moisture in an environment where water was becoming increasingly precious. These discoveries expand the picture of human engagement with the Akarkas landscape, suggesting populations that did more than paint on rock walls and camp in sheltered locations, populations that invested labour in shaping the terrain itself, that built infrastructure whose remains persist millennia after abandonment. What activities did these features support? What organisational capacity did their construction require? What knowledge of the landscape and its possibilities informed their positioning and design? The Akarkas investigations continue, each field season adding new data to an accumulating record, each technological advance revealing features that previous methods missed. The LiDAR survey covered only a fraction of the massif's total extent. Vast areas remaining uninvestigated, their secrets preserved by the simple fact that no one has yet looked. The rock art panels that have been documented number in the thousands, but estimates suggest thousands more await recording in canyons and shelters that researchers have not yet entered. The occupation deposits that have been excavated represent tiny samples of the total archaeological record. Each dig a probe into accumulated sediments that extend deeper and wider than any investigation has yet explored. The scale of what remains unknown dwarfs what has been learned, the inventory of mysteries growing faster than research can address. And the mysteries that have emerged from investigation already challenge comfortable assumptions about the capabilities of prehistoric Saharan populations. The sophistication of the art itself, the technical skill evident in the best panels, the apparent knowledge of anatomy and movement displayed in the most accomplished figures, these qualities invite comparison with accomplished artistic traditions anywhere in the ancient world. The organisational implications of some features suggest coordination beyond the level of individual families or small bands, collective action that required planning and perhaps leadership of some kind. The persistence of occupation across millennia, populations returning to the same locations across the full span of the wet Sahara period and into the early phases of drying, suggest cultural continuity and accumulated knowledge that contradicts images of prehistoric peoples as ephemeral wanderers leaving no lasting trace. The Akarkas record preserves evidence of deep history, communities with traditions extending across timescales measured in centuries and millennia, people who knew their landscape intimately and invested in maintaining relationships with particular places across generations. The pattern that emerges across our journey through the buried Sahara takes clearer shape with each site we encounter. The Eye of the Sahara, with its geological enigmas and its tantalizing circumstantial suggestions of human presence. The foggara systems of the Garamantes, hydraulic engineering that sustained cities in what became hyper-arid desert. The lost lakes preserved in rock art, testimony to landscapes that no longer exist. The Zazura legends that satellite imagery has given strange new credibility. The pyramids of Meroë, achievements of a civilization that commanded iron and administered an empire yet left its script undeciphered and its history largely unwritten. The Tichet Walata tradition, agricultural innovation during the final wet phase, populations dispersing as the desert advanced, carrying knowledge that may have seeded later kingdoms. And now the Tadrat Akarkas, where LiDAR peels back layers of sand and stone to reveal complexities that earlier research glimpsed but could not fully see. What links these places is not merely geography, though all occupy the vast expanse of terrain we now call the Sahara. Nor is it merely chronology, though all date to periods when the desert was not yet desert, when water sustained life in regions now hostile to nearly all living things. What links them is the persistent theme of achievement obscured, capability concealed, complexity erased by the climatic and historical processes that have shaped the region across subsequent millennia. Each site offers fragments of a larger picture that remains maddeningly incomplete, pieces of a puzzle whose total extent we cannot measure because so much remains buried, unexplored, unknown. The questions compound rather than resolve as our journey proceeds. Was there connection between these scattered sites, or did each develop independently, parallel responses to similar conditions producing similar results without direct contact? Did knowledge flow across the ancient Sahara as the rivers once did, linking distant populations through exchange and migration and cultural transmission? Did traditions developed in one region influence developments elsewhere? Or do the apparent similarities reflect convergent evolution, the limited range of solutions available to human problems producing superficially similar outcomes in distant locations? The conventional answers emphasize independence and local development, and for good reason. The distances involved are vast, hundreds and thousands of kilometers separating the sites we have visited, terrain that even in wet periods would have posed challenges to regular communication. The chronologies do not always align neatly, some sites flourishing while others had not yet developed or had already declined, temporal disjunctions that complicate arguments for connection. The material evidence for long-distance exchange exists but remains limited. Trade goods travelling impressive distances, but hardly suggesting the integrated networks that arguments for cultural unity would require. Skepticism toward grand unifying theories is appropriate given what the evidence actually shows, yet the questions persist, refusing to stay closed regardless of how firmly the mainstream account seems to settle them. The foggara technology of the Garamantes resembles water management systems found in other regions, in Persia, in Arabia, in the Americas, technologies whose distribution has puzzled researchers because independent invention of such sophisticated systems seems remarkable, yet documented transmission routes often cannot be established. The pyramidal tombs of Meroë echo forms found in Egypt, yet developed their own distinctive characteristics, raising questions about how influence operated and what local factors shaped the reception of foreign ideas. The rock art of the Tadrat Carcass belongs to a broader Saharan tradition extending across thousands of kilometers, similarity of style suggesting connection even when the specific mechanisms of transmission remain opaque. The millet domestication that occurred in the Tichit region contributed to an agricultural revolution whose effects reached far beyond the immediate locale, knowledge spreading through processes that archaeology can trace only partially. These echoes and parallels and distant resonances suggest a connected world, populations in contact across distances that seem imposing to modern eyes but may have posed less barrier to ancient peoples than we readily imagine. Standing amid the rock art galleries of the Carcass, surrounded by images left by hands that moved across these surfaces thousands of years ago, one cannot help but wonder what those artists would make of the questions we bring to their work. Did they think of themselves as isolated, inhabitants of a particular canyon system, with no knowledge of or interest in what lay beyond the horizon? Or did they conceive themselves as part of a larger world, participants in networks of exchange and kinship and belief that extended beyond what daily life directly revealed? The paintings themselves offer hints but not answers, images depicting objects and animals and humans engaged in activities whose meaning the artists themselves would have understood immediately, but that we can only guess at across the gulf of millennia. The figures that seem to wear elaborate headdresses, that carry objects whose function we cannot identify, that gather in assemblies whose purpose is lost, these images record something, but what? The wind that sighs through the Carcass canyons carries sand from elsewhere, particles that have travelled hundreds of kilometres on atmospheric currents, material that was once stone in some distant mountain, weathered and transported and deposited here where it slowly accumulates in drifts and pockets and layers. The rock surfaces where artists worked slowly weather too, the same forces that carry sand grain by grain, also removing the outer layers of sandstone, taking with them the pigments and incisions that mark human presence, erasing the record that preservation has protected. The Carcass art survives because conditions have favoured its persistence, but it does not survive intact. Much has been lost already, and more is lost each decade, each century, each millennium that passes. The complete record of human artistic expression in this region included far more than what remains, panels that weathered away before anyone documented them, images that faded beyond recognition while their neighbours persisted, a selective survival that biases what we can study toward what conditions happen to preserve. What were we unable to learn because the evidence no longer exists? What questions cannot be asked because their answers have been erased? The LiDAR surveys that continue in the Akarkas and in similar environments throughout the Sahara offer hope that technology will outrun decay, that we will document what survives before erosion and weathering complete their work. But the hope is tempered by awareness of how much documentation remains to be done and how limited are the resources available. Each field season addresses a fraction of what requires attention. Each technological advance reveals features that previous methods missed, expanding the inventory of the unknown even as it fills gaps in existing knowledge. The pace of discovery accelerates, but so does the pace of loss, human activity adding new threats to the natural processes that have always slowly worn away the record. Modern populations in the Sahara face their own challenges, political instability and economic pressure, and climate stress combining to make protection of archaeological resources difficult to prioritise. Sites that survived millennia of natural weathering fall victim to looting, to development, to conflict, to neglect, their treasures dispersed before they can be studied, their context destroyed before it can be documented. The darkness that falls over the Akarkas is absolute, a blackness unmarked by the light pollution that haunts even remote corners of more populated continents, and in that darkness the stars emerge with a brilliance that modern urban observers can scarcely imagine. The same sky spread above the ancient artists, the same constellations wheeling through their nightly courses, the same Milky Way arcing overhead in a river of light that must have seemed as permanent and meaningful as the stone beneath their feet. Did they read stories in those patterns? Trace the movements of celestial bodies as calendars marking seasons and ceremonies and migrations? The astronomical knowledge of ancient peoples throughout the world has proven repeatedly more sophisticated than earlier scholars assumed. Careful observations accumulated over generations encoding information about celestial mechanics that would not be formally described until millennia later. What the Akakis painters knew of the sky above them, what they might have recorded in symbols we do not recognize as astronomical, what calendrical systems they developed to organize their lives around the movements of sun and moon and stars, these questions hover unanswered over the canyon galleries where their art endures. The morning light returns to the Akarkas with the same gradual revelation that has marked each dawn for millions of years, shadows retreating across rock surfaces as the sun climbs higher, colours shifting from the cool blues of pre-dawn to the warm golds and oranges that characterise the desert day. In that light the painted figures seem to stir, an effect of changing illumination on uneven surfaces, but an effect that nonetheless gives the uncanny impression of movement frozen and then released, as if the images themselves were waiting for the sun to bring them back to something like life. The herders and their cattle, the hunters and their prey, the dancers and their mysterious rituals, all caught in poses that suggest moments extracted from continuous action, gestures that imply what came before and what would follow if the scene were permitted to continue. The artistic conventions that shaped these images were not arbitrary, not random choices made by individual painters working without reference to tradition. They represent accumulated aesthetic decisions, techniques refined over generations, a visual language that would have been immediately legible to contemporary viewers, but that we must learn to read across distances of time and culture that resist easy translation. And yet the effort to understand continues, each new study adding fragments to the incomplete picture, each technological advance opening possibilities that previous researchers lacked. The LiDAR data that revealed settlement patterns invisible from the ground continues to be analysed, algorithms identifying features that escaped initial review, the sheer volume of information requiring time and expertise to process fully. Beneath the dunes and the rocky surfaces of the Tadrat Akarkas lie more secrets, features that even sophisticated remote sensing cannot detect, buried remnants of the lives lived here when the climate was kinder and the land was green. Excavation would reveal some of what lies hidden, but excavation is slow and expensive and destructive, each dig disturbing the context it seeks to understand, each trench removing forever the possibility of future researchers approaching the same material with better methods. The decisions about what to excavate and what to leave for later are never simple, balancing the urgency of questions against the irreversibility of investigation. weighing the value of knowledge now against the potential for greater knowledge later. What lies beneath the Akarsis sands will not wait forever. Natural processes continue their work regardless of human schedules, erosion and deposition, and chemical transformation altering the buried record according to principles that care nothing for archaeological convenience. Our journey now carries us northward, away from the canyon galleries of the Tadrata Caucasus, and across terrain that grows ever more severe, more inhospitable, more seemingly empty of the traces we have been following. The central Sahara stretches before us like an ocean of stone and sand, its dimensions almost impossible to comprehend from any single vantage point, a landscape that dwarfs human presence and human time scales alike. Yet this apparent emptiness deceives, just as it has deceived at every stage of our passage through the desert's secrets. Somewhere ahead, where the borders of Egypt and Libya blur into administrative abstractions laid across indifferent sand, lies Zazura, the oasis that may or may not exist, the legendary white city that has drawn seekers for centuries and that continues to resist definitive discovery or definitive dismissal. The name itself carries the weight of accumulated longings, Zazura, spoken by travellers and treasure hunters and romantics across generations, attached to varying descriptions and conflicting locations, but always denoting something precious, hidden somewhere in the vastness of the Western Desert. Medieval Arabic texts mention it, though their accounts differ in details that make correlation with specific geography difficult. A 15th century manuscript known as the Kitab al-Kanuz, the Book of Hidden Pearls, describes Zazura as a white city, a gleaming settlement somewhere in the desert between the Nile Valley and the oases of the Western Desert, guarded perhaps by supernatural forces, containing treasures that would reward those bold or lucky enough to find it. Later accounts add details or contradict earlier ones, building a legend that grew more elaborate with each telling while remaining frustratingly vague about the one detail that mattered most. Where exactly was this place? The European explorers who pushed into the Sahara during the 19th and early 20th centuries encountered these legends and found themselves enchanted. Men accustomed to systematic inquiry, trained in the scientific methods of their age, nonetheless felt the pull of the mythical city, the romance of discovering what others had sought and failed to find. The Zazura Club, founded in the early 20th century, brought together some of the most accomplished desert explorers of their generation, men who had mapped vast stretches of previously unknown terrain, who had survived conditions that killed less prepared travellers, who had made contributions to geography and archaeology that earned them recognition in learned societies. Yet they gathered around the quest for a city that might be nothing more than legend, a mirage of the collective imagination rather than a feature of the physical landscape. Their expeditions pushed into regions that had never been systematically explored, crossing terrain where vehicle tracks were the first marks of the wheeled transport in human history, where the footprints they left might have been the first human presence in millennia. They found oases, some known and some new, but Zazura itself remained elusive, always potentially just beyond the next dune field, just past the next stretch of Hamada, just over the horizon that retreated as they advanced. The Gilf Kebir, a massive sandstone plateau rising from the desert floor in the corner where Egypt meets Libya and Sudan, became a focus of their search. Its name, meaning the Great Barrier, reflects the impression it makes on those who approach across the surrounding plains, a wall of rock that seems to block passage into whatever lies beyond. The plateau's surface, fractured by wadis and canyons, offered the possibility of hidden valleys, sheltered spots where springs might emerge and vegetation might grow, places that could harbour settlements invisible from the surrounding desert. The explorers found caves adorned with rock art, images that proved human presence in the distant past, swimmers and cattle and figures engaged in activities that only made sense in a landscape utterly different from the hyper-arid waste that surrounded them now. The Cave of the Swimmers, discovered in 1933, became famous, its images reproduced and analysed, and eventually woven into popular culture through channels that would have astonished its discoverers. Human figures with arms extended, bodies horizontal, in postures that unmistakably depicted swimming, movement through water in a place where water had not existed for thousands of years. The rock art confirmed what geology and climate science would later elaborate, that the Sahara had once been wet, that the Gilf Kebir and its surroundings had supported human populations during a period when conditions were radically different from the present. But the art did not confirm Zazura, did not prove that the legendary White City had ever existed as a physical place rather than a persistent dream. The explorers of the Zerzura Club mapped vast areas, documented important sites, contributed enormously to knowledge of the Western Desert's geography and prehistory, but they did not find what they were ultimately seeking. Zerzura remained undiscovered, its status oscillating between tantalizing possibility and probable myth. Yet the legend would not die, and in recent decades new technologies have reopened questions that the early explorers could only approach through direct physical search. Satellite imagery now reveals the desert's surface in detail that no ground expedition could hope to match, covering in hours what would take months or years to traverse on foot or by vehicle. Radar systems penetrate the sand, detecting features buried beneath meters of dune, revealing paleo-drainage networks and ancient surfaces that never break the modern ground level. And in this satellite data, anomalies have appeared, features that do not match natural geological formations, patterns that suggest human modification of the landscape in places where human presence has not been documented. The radar imagery of the Western Desert has revealed what researchers call paleo-channels, the courses of ancient rivers that once flowed across terrain now utterly dry, carrying water from highlands that still receive occasional rainfall to lowlands, where that water collected in lakes and marshes long since vanished. These ghost rivers show clearly in the radar returns, their distinct signatures cutting through the uniform background of undifferentiated sand, mapping a hydrological network that would have supported abundant life during the periods when it functioned. Along these paleo-channels, in locations that would have been attractive to settlement during the wet phases, anomalies appear, features that require explanation. Some are clearly natural, geological formations whose shapes happen to catch the radar in ways that suggest artificiality to hopeful observers. Others remain ambiguous, their characteristics falling into ranges that could be explained by either natural or human processes, features that require ground truthing to interpret definitively, but that lie in areas where ground access is extremely difficult. The desert keeps its secrets, and the political boundaries that cross it keep researchers at bay, permits difficult to obtain, security situations unstable, logistics challenging beyond what even well-funded expeditions can easily manage. The anomalies wait, their true nature uncertain, their potential implications ranging from mundane geological curiosity to evidence of settlements that history has forgotten. Could Zerzura be among them? Could the legendary White City have a basis in physical reality, a settlement of sufficient size and distinction to generate the legends that medieval writers recorded, a place that flourished during the wet phases and was subsequently buried beneath the encroaching desert? The possibility cannot be dismissed, though it equally cannot be confirmed. The satellite data shows something, but what that something represents remains interpretation rather than certainty. The distance between an anomaly on a radar image and a confirmed archaeological site is measured in expensive expeditions and difficult logistics, and years of patient work that may or may not yield the answers sought. What drives the persistence of the Zerzura legend? The continuing fascination with a city that has never been convincingly found? Perhaps it is simply human nature, the same impulse that drives all exploration, all research, all seeking after knowledge that lies just beyond current reach. Perhaps it is something specific to the Sahara itself, to the desert's paradoxical combination of apparent emptiness and hidden depth, its invitation to project onto its blankness whatever visions the observer carries. The legend of Zerzura taps into deep structures of human imagination, the lost city, the hidden treasure, this secret preserved through ages while the world changed around it. These themes recur across cultures and across centuries, suggesting something fundamental about how humans relate to landscape and to time. The satellite anomalies that have been tentatively linked to the Zerzura legend cluster in several areas, none of them easily accessible, all of them in terrain that defeated earlier explorers. The technology that revealed them is not sufficient to explain them. Only ground investigation can determine what lies beneath the patterns that the radar detects. Until that investigation occurs, if it ever does, the anomalies remain Rorschach tests, screens onto which observers project their assumptions and their hopes. Skeptics see natural formations exaggerated by pattern-seeking minds. Believers see confirmation of legends passed down through centuries of oral and written transmission. The data supports both readings without confirming either. The journey we have made across the Sahara has repeatedly encountered this threshold. the boundary between what is known and what is suspected, between documented fact and tantalizing possibility. The Eye of the Sahara, with its enigmatic circular form and its geological explanations that nonetheless leave questions unanswered. The Garamantes, whose underground water systems demonstrated engineering sophistication that transformed understanding of ancient Saharan capability. The Green Sahara rock art, depicting a world that climate science confirms existed, but whose human inhabitants remain largely anonymous. The Tichet Walata settlements, challenging assumptions about where complex societies could develop and when. The LiDAR revelations at Tadrat Akakis, showing that technologies we thought we understood could still surprise us with what they reveal. And now Zazura, the legendary oasis that hovers between myth and reality, its existence neither proven nor disproven, its secrets still held by a desert that has swallowed so much else. If Zazura exists, if a settlement of sufficient importance to generate lasting legend lies buried somewhere in the western desert, what would its discovery mean? The legends describe treasures, wealth accumulated and hidden, gold and jewels and precious objects waiting for a finder fortunate enough to reach them. But the real treasure would be knowledge, evidence of how people lived and organized and thought during periods from which so little direct testimony survives. A site significant enough to generate legend would be a site of considerable archaeological importance, offering insights into social organization and material culture and environmental adaptation that no number of smaller sites could provide. The hope that drives the search for Zazura, beneath the romantic veneer of treasure hunting and adventure, is the hope of understanding, of recovering information that would illuminate the human past in this region that has been so thoroughly erased by climate change and time. The sand that covers the potential site, assuming it exists, also protects it, preserving through aridity and burial what more exposed sites would have lost to weathering and decay. The same processes that make discovery difficult also make discovery potentially valuable. Organic materials that would have vanished elsewhere persisting in the desert's preservative environment. Delicate artifacts surviving intact through millennia of entombment. What might be found if Zazura were found? Textiles, perhaps, the fabrics that clothed a population and that offer insight into technology and trade. Wooden objects that reveal craft traditions. Food remains that speak to diet and agriculture and economic organization. Human remains that carry genetic information and evidence of health and nutrition and cause of death. The sealed tomb effect, the protection afforded by burial in hyper-arid sand, could make Zazura's discovery extraordinarily informative, far beyond what surface sites typically yield. But the conditional remains conditional. The legends remain legends. The satellite anomalies remain unexplained. The desert keeps its secrets, patient beyond human patience, indifferent to human curiosity, waiting perhaps for no one, concealing perhaps nothing, or perhaps concealing everything that the hopeful imagine and more. The explorers of the Zazura Club died without finding what they sought, their expeditions passing into history, their legacy the maps and records and photographs that documented what they did find, even as they failed to find what they most wanted. Modern researchers inherit their questions and their frustrations, equipped with better tools but facing the same fundamental challenge. The desert is vast, and what it contains is hidden from view. Standing at the edge of the Gilth Kabir, looking out across the sand sea that stretches to horizons too distant for the eye to process, one feels the weight of that vastness, the crushing scale of a landscape that reduces human presence to near invisibility. Somewhere in that expanse, perhaps, lies Zazura. Somewhere in those dunes, perhaps, are buried the remains of a settlement whose inhabitants looked out across terrain as changed from their experience as ours is from theirs. They are gone. Their city, if it existed, is gone, swallowed by the same processes that transform the Green Sahara into the world's largest hot desert. What remains is the legend, passed from voice to voice across centuries, refined and embellished and questioned but never finally resolved. The technology that creates satellite anomalies will eventually be supplemented by technology that can interpret them, ground-penetrating systems that might be deployed without requiring physical presence, autonomous platforms that could explore terrain too difficult or dangerous for human expedition. The pace of technological change suggests that answers will come, eventually, though whether in years or decades or longer is impossible to predict. What seems certain is that the desert has not yielded all its secrets, that discoveries remain to be made, that the patient investigation of the Sahara's buried past will continue to reward those who undertake it with revelations that reshape understanding. The wind that blows across the Gilf Kabir carries sand from distant sources, particles that have travelled hundreds of kilometres on atmospheric currents, dust that was once stone in mountains now worn to nubs, the detritus of geological time redistributed across a landscape that is itself constantly moving, constantly changing, constantly rearranging its features in ways that human timescales cannot perceive. That wind has blown for millions of years, since long before humans existed to feel it, and it will blow for millions more after the last human question has been asked and answered or abandoned. Against that scale, the search for Zazura seems almost quixotic, a brief human obsession set against the indifference of deep time. And yet it continues, because humans cannot help but seek, cannot help but question, cannot help but hope that the next expedition, the next satellite pass, the next application of technology to ancient mystery, will finally reveal what has been hidden for so long. The late afternoon light slants across the desert surface, casting shadows that stretch eastward from every rock and ridge, creating a texture that transforms the terrain's apparent flatness into something more complex, more varied, more suggestive of what might lie just beneath the visible. In that light, the sand seems almost liquid, flowing in visual ripples that parallel the actual ripples of the dunes, a surface that conceals as much as it reveals, a covering that could hide anything or nothing. The seekers after Zazura have passed this way before, their vehicles leaving tracks that the wind erased within hours, their camps set up and struck and forgotten by a landscape that remembers nothing of their presence. The desert cares nothing for human legends, nothing for human hopes, nothing for the questions that drive the search. It simply exists, vast and patient and silent, keeping whatever secrets it holds until such time as those secrets choose to emerge or are forced into view by tools that have not yet been invented. As the sun descends toward the western horizon, painting the sky in colours that seem too vivid to be real, the temperature begins its precipitous drop. The desert's lack of moisture allowing heat to escape into space with no atmospheric buffer to slow its passage. The same stars that rose over the Akarkas painters will rise here too, the same constellations wheeling through their ancient courses, the same questions hanging unanswered in the clear desert air. What lies beneath the sand? What secrets has the desert preserved? What knowledge has been lost that might yet be recovered? The questions drift upward into the darkening sky like smoke from fires long extinguished, joining the countless other questions that have risen from this desert across millennia of human wonder. And as the first stars emerge above the Gilf Kabir, their light-travelling distances that dwarf even the vast Saharan expanses, we turn our attention southward, toward a place where questions have found answers of a sort, though answers that only multiply the mysteries they purport to resolve. For our final destination lies not in the speculative realm of legend, but in the documented certainty of stone and inscription, where pyramids rise from desert sands in numbers that exceed those of Egypt itself, where an African civilization flourished for over a millennium in sophisticated isolation, and where the relationship between what the desert has preserved and what it has hidden achieves its most profound expression. We journey now to Meroë, to the buried pyramids of Sudan, where the sand that swallowed so much has also protected monuments that survive today as testament to a civilization that mainstream history has only recently begun to understand. The transition from the Western Sahara to the Nile corridor requires crossing terrain that shifts in character as dramatically as it changes in location. The rocky plateaus and sand seas of Libya and Egypt give way to the narrow ribbon of cultivated land that hugs the Nile's banks, a strip of green that has sustained human civilization for at least 10,000 years, possibly longer. South of Egypt, beyond the cataracts that historically impeded river navigation, the landscape opens into what the ancients called Nubia, a region whose relationship with its northern neighbour oscillated across centuries between conquest and commerce, domination and diplomatic equality, cultural absorption and proud independence. It is here, approximately 200 kilometres northeast of Khartoum, that the ruins of Meroë stretch across terrain that oscillates between cultivation and desolation, between the life-giving Nile and the encroaching desert that presses against its banks with relentless patience. The site encompasses an area of several square kilometres, though the most famous features, the pyramids themselves, cluster in 3 distinct cemeteries that together contain more than 200 individual structures, a concentration of monumental burial architecture unmatched anywhere else on the African continent. The first impression upon approaching the Meroë pyramids often catches visitors by surprise, not because of their number, which is indeed striking, but because of their proportions. These are not structures on the scale of Giza, whose Great Pyramid rises 146 metres from base to apex, dominating the landscape for kilometres in every direction. The Meroë pyramids are smaller, ranging from approximately 6 to 30 metres in height, with bases typically between 8 and 12 metres on a side. Their angles of inclination are steeper than their Egyptian counterparts, typically approaching 70 degrees compared to the Egyptian 51 or 52, giving them a more pointed, more vertical profile that some observers describe as more elegant, others as more peculiar. Attached to most of the pyramids are mortuary chapels, small structures with decorated walls and entrances that face eastward toward the rising sun, creating a consistent orientation that speaks to shared religious beliefs across generations of builders. The chapels once housed cult objects and facilitated rituals for the honoured dead, though centuries of neglect and deliberate destruction have left many in states of advanced deterioration. Their decorated walls sandblasted to indistinction, their roofs collapsed, their doorways choked with debris. Mainstream archaeology has developed a reasonably comprehensive chronology for the Meroë pyramids and the civilization that built them. The site served as the capital of the Kingdom of Kush from approximately 591 BCE, when the Kushite rulers relocated southward after the Assyrian invasion of Egypt forced their withdrawal from territories they had briefly controlled. For the next 9 centuries, until approximately 350 CE, Meroë functioned as the political, economic, and religious centre of a state that at its height controlled territory, stretching from the Egyptian border deep into the African interior, a domain that encompassed diverse peoples, multiple ecological zones, and trade routes that connected Mediterranean commerce with resources from sub-Saharan Africa. The pyramids served as royal tombs, housing the remains of kings, queens, and high officials in burial chambers excavated beneath the structures, chambers that were accessed through descending passages and then sealed, theoretically forever, beneath tons of stone and sand. The excavation history of Meroë reveals much about the contingent nature of archaeological knowledge, the degree to which what we know depends on who looked and when, and with what assumptions. The site was known to European explorers from at least the early 19th century, when travellers documented the pyramids and speculated about their origins, often attributing them to Egyptian colonisation rather than acknowledging indigenous African achievement. The most notorious episode in Meroë's modern history occurred in the 1830s, when the Italian treasure hunter Giuseppe Ferlini systematically demolished the tops of more than 40 pyramids in search of grave goods, destroying irreplaceable archaeological context in pursuit of gold and jewels that he mostly failed to find. The damage Ferlini inflicted remains visible today, the truncated pyramids standing as monuments to colonial-era destructiveness as much as to Kushite achievement. Subsequent excavations conducted with increasing professionalism through the 20th and into the 21st century have recovered much information despite Ferlini's depredations, establishing the succession of rulers, the evolution of architectural styles, the nature of burial practices, and the religious beliefs that shaped Meroitic culture across nearly a millennium of recorded history. Yet the mainstream narrative, comprehensive as it has become, leaves substantial questions unanswered, gaps in knowledge that invite speculation about what the desert has hidden, that might reshape understanding if it were revealed. The Meroitic script, for instance, remains only partially deciphered despite more than a century of scholarly effort. Researchers can read the script's alphabetic signs, can transliterate texts into their phonetic values, but the language itself, unrelated to any known linguistic family, resists full comprehension. Inscriptions that cover temple walls, stela, and tomb chapels preserve words whose sounds are known but whose meanings remain elusive, tantalizingly close to understanding yet frustratingly beyond reach. What stories might these texts tell if they could be fully read? What histories, what religious concepts, What scientific or practical knowledge might they preserve that current methods cannot extract? The question of Meroitic literacy points to a larger question about the relationship between what has been preserved and what has been lost. The pyramids survive because they were built of stone, because the desert climate inhibits decay, because the sites were remote enough from modern population centres to escape the most intensive stone robbing that dismantled so many ancient structures elsewhere. But what of the organic materials, the papyri and leather and wooden tablets that might have preserved the full flowering of Meroitic literature, philosophy, science, administration? The dry conditions that favour preservation also favour combustion, and texts that survive centuries in sealed chambers could be lost in moments to fire, either deliberate destruction or accidental conflagration. The archive of Meroë, if such an archive existed in the sense that archives existed in Egypt or Mesopotamia, has never been found, leaving scholars to reconstruct an entire civilization's intellectual life from monumental inscriptions and occasional fragments, a task akin to reconstructing English literature from tombstone epitaphs alone. Ground-penetrating radar surveys and other remote sensing technologies have begun to reveal the extent of what lies beneath the sand at Meroë and surrounding sites. The results suggest that the visible monuments, impressive as they are, represent only a fraction of the total archaeological resource. Entire city quarters remain unexcavated, their street plans traceable on satellite imagery but their contents unknown. Cemeteries beyond the royal burial grounds presumably contain the remains of ordinary Meroats, their graves unmarked by pyramids but potentially rich in the everyday objects that reveal how most people actually lived. Industrial areas where iron was smelted, ceramics fired, textiles woven, have been identified but barely investigated. Their slag heaps and kiln remains promising evidence of technological practices that made Meroë one of the ancient world's major centres of iron production. The scale of what remains to be discovered dwarfs what has already been found, a disproportion that makes current understanding provisional at best, likely to be transformed by future excavation in ways that cannot be predicted. The iron production of Meroë has particularly intrigued researchers, who have long noted that the slag mounds surrounding the ancient city suggest industrial output far exceeding what local consumption could have required. At the height of Meroitic production, the furnaces were consuming forest resources at rates that must have significantly impacted regional ecology, transforming woodland into charcoal to fuel the insatiable appetite of iron smelting. Some researchers have proposed that Meroë functioned as an industrial centre, exporting iron products across vast distances, a factory city whose output supplied markets throughout northeastern Africa and perhaps beyond. Others have questioned this interpretation, noting that the logistics of transporting heavy metal goods across desert and savanna would have been prohibitively expensive, suggesting instead that the iron served primarily local and regional needs. The debate continues, unresolved for lack of evidence that remains buried, waiting for excavation that may never come or may not come soon enough to answer the questions of those who ask them now. Standing among the Meroë pyramids, as the sun crosses the meridian, casting shadows so short they nearly disappear, one becomes aware of a presence that transcends the merely archaeological. These structures were built by people who believed deeply in the continuity between life and death, who invested enormous resources in ensuring that the transition from one state to the other would proceed correctly, that the deceased would achieve whatever form of afterlife their religion promised. The architectural forms they chose, pyramids rather than the mastabas or rock-cut tombs that could have served equally well, speak to a deliberate invocation of Egyptian precedent, a conscious connection to the civilization that had dominated this region for centuries before Kushite independence reasserted itself. Yet the pyramids are not Egyptian in any slavish sense. Their proportions are distinct, their decorative programs show indigenous influence, their builders adapted foreign forms to local purposes in ways that demonstrate creative agency rather than mere imitation. The Meroats looked north and saw a model worth emulating, but they transformed that model into something that was unmistakably their own. The question of cultural transmission between Egypt and Nubia, between Mediterranean civilizations and African societies to the south, has occupied scholars for generations and remains contentious in ways that extend beyond purely academic disputes. For much of the modern period, Western scholars assumed that cultural innovation flowed exclusively from north to south, that Nubian achievements were derivative of Egyptian originals, that the African interior received civilization from outside rather than generating it independently. This diffusionist model has been challenged in recent decades by evidence suggesting more complex patterns of exchange, periods when Nubian cultures influenced Egyptian practices rather than merely receiving Egyptian influence, moments when the flow of ideas reversed, or when distinct traditions developed in parallel without direct connection. The Meroitic civilization, in this revised understanding, appears not as a provincial echo of Egyptian greatness, but as an independent achievement that drew selectively on multiple sources while maintaining its own distinctive character across nearly 1,000 years of continuous development. The end of Meroë remains as mysterious as many aspects of its flourishing. Sometime around 350 CE, the royal pyramid burials cease, the inscriptions fall silent, the city that had functioned as capital for 9 centuries fades from historical record. What happened? Conventional explanations invoke military conquest by the Aksumite kingdom centered in what is now Ethiopia, environmental degradation that undermined the agricultural base, economic disruption that severed trade connections, or some combination of these factors acting together to produce decline and abandonment. The truth is that no one knows with certainty, that the evidence is fragmentary and ambiguous, that the final chapter of Meroitic history remains unwritten because the sources that would allow it to be written either never existed or have not survived. The civilization simply ends, leaving its monuments to the desert and its language to puzzle future generations who cannot read it. The Meroë pyramids thus embody the central themes that have run through this journey across the buried Sahara. The interplay between preservation and loss, between what the sand protects and what it conceals, between the questions we can answer and those that remain permanently open. Here, unlike at Zazura or the Green Sahara rock art sites, we have abundant material evidence, structures that can be measured and dated, inscriptions that can be at least partially read, a chronological framework that situates developments within broader historical contexts. Yet the mysteries persist, the undeciphered language, the missing archives, the unexplained decline, the extent of what remains buried. Meroë is not legend but archaeological fact, yet it retains an aura of the unknown that rivals any of the more speculative sites we have visited. The desert has preserved it, but the desert has also kept secrets that preservation alone cannot reveal. As the afternoon advances and the shadows begin their eastward lengthening, we prepare to complete the final leg of our journey, travelling westward once more into the deep Sahara, toward a site that has only recently yielded its secrets to modern technology and that promises to reshape understanding of prehistoric settlement in ways that are still being processed. The Tadra Takakus Mountains of southwestern Libya, which we visited earlier to contemplate their rock art, have more recently become the subject of LiDAR survey, the same laser scanning technology that has revolutionized archaeology in forested regions by penetrating vegetation to reveal buried structures. In the desert, where vegetation is sparse, LiDAR serves a different purpose, mapping microtopography in detail sufficient to identify features invisible to surface observation, subtle depressions and elevations that indicate buried walls, collapsed structures, or ancient landscaping. The results from Tadra Takakus have proven remarkable, revealing a density of prehistoric settlement that far exceeds what surface survey had suggested, a landscape not merely decorated with rock art but populated by communities whose physical remains have been detected though not yet excavated. The journey westward crosses terrain that has become familiar through repetition, the transition from Nile Valley to open desert, from cultivation to desolation, from the concentrated green of water-served land to the austere browns and tans of regions where rainfall is measured in millimeters per decade. The Sahara that lies between Meroë and the Akakas is not uniform but varied, comprising gravel plains and sand seas, rocky outcrops and ephemeral drainage channels, terrain that looks lifeless but supports specialized organisms adapted to extreme aridity. Crossing this space requires preparation and equipment, supplies of fuel and water sufficient to reach destinations where neither is available, navigation systems capable of maintaining course across landscapes without distinctive features, the logistical infrastructure that makes modern Saharan travel possible, where earlier expeditions risk death from thirst or disorientation. The desert remains dangerous, remains capable of killing the unwary or unlucky, but it is accessible now in ways that would have seemed miraculous to the seekers after Zazura, whose camels and determination carried them into regions that vehicles and satellites now render almost routine. The Tadrat Akakus mountains rise from the surrounding plains like islands from a sea, their eroded sandstone forms creating a landscape of towers and canyons, arches and overhangs, sculptural shapes that seem designed rather than randomly produced. The rock art that decorates these formations has been known and studied for decades, catalogued and analysed and interpreted within frameworks that evolved as understanding of the Green Sahara deepened. But the LiDAR surveys conducted in recent years have added a new dimension to this familiar site, revealing patterns of settlement invisible to earlier researchers, detecting the signatures of structures that surface inspection missed, mapping a prehistoric landscape in unprecedented detail. The results suggest that during the wet phases of the Holocene, when the Sahara bloomed with life, the Tadrat Akakus supported populations far denser than previous estimates had proposed, communities organised in ways that imply social complexity beyond the hunting-gathering bands that earlier models assumed. The LiDAR data shows clusters of what appear to be dwelling sites, arranged in patterns that suggest planning rather than random accumulation, structures whose sizes and relationships to one another indicate differentiated functions within organised settlements. Stone alignments that might represent foundations or property boundaries create grids that bear uncomfortable resemblance to planned villages, layouts that seem too regular to have emerged organically from individual families building where they chose, storage facilities, identified by their consistent shapes and positions relative to dwelling sites, suggest economies that produce surpluses requiring containment and protection, agricultural or pastoral outputs that exceeded immediate consumption and necessitated infrastructure for preservation. The picture that emerges is of a region that was not merely visited by mobile peoples, but inhabited by established communities, populations that invested in permanent structures because they intended to remain, settlements that functioned as centres of social, economic, and presumably ritual activity across generations. Mainstream archaeology has not yet had time to fully process these findings, which challenge models that characterise Saharan prehistory as dominated by nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples who left few permanent traces. The LiDAR evidence suggests instead that settled life was possible, and perhaps common during wet phases, that the dichotomy between mobile hunter-gatherers and settled agricultural villages may be too simple to capture the range of adaptations that Saharan peoples developed. Some researchers have proposed that the Green Sahara supported a continuum of settlement patterns, from fully nomadic groups that moved constantly in pursuit of game and forage, through various degrees of semi-sedentary occupation, to fully settled communities that remained in place year-round, exploiting local resources through farming, herding, or intensive collection of wild foods. The LiDAR findings from Tadrat Akakus support the settled end of this spectrum, suggesting that at least some portions of the Sahara during its wet phases resembled the village landscapes of contemporary agricultural societies rather than the vast empty spaces that characterize the region today. The implications extend beyond academic debates about settlement typology. If substantial settled communities existed in the Sahara during the Holocene wet phases, if villages and perhaps towns developed in regions now covered by sand, then the transition to aridity represented not merely environmental change but civilizational collapse, the abandonment of established ways of life by populations forced to relocate or perish. The rock art that drew our attention earlier in this journey might then represent not the casual expression of transient peoples, but the cultural production of settled societies, art created by communities with the stability and surplus to support specialists in image making, traditions transmitted across generations in places where generations actually succeeded one another in continuous occupation. The sophistication of some Saharan rock art, its technical refinement and thematic consistency, would make more sense as the product of established artistic traditions than as the spontaneous creation of mobile bands. Yet the LiDAR evidence, striking as it is, raises more questions than it answers. The features detected by laser scanning have not been excavated, their ages not determined, their functions not confirmed by the material evidence that digging would reveal. The patterns that look like planned settlements might prove to be natural formations whose regularity is coincidental. The stone alignments might date from historical rather than prehistoric periods. The whole interpretation might require revision as ground truthing proceeds. The technology that detected these features cannot date them, cannot identify the people who created them, cannot reconstruct the lifeways that might have sustained the communities whose traces it has found. LiDAR is a tool for seeing, not for understanding, and what it reveals requires investigation by methods that remain, in the final analysis, dependent on physical access to sites that the desert protects with all its formidable hostility. The sun descends toward the western horizon as we contemplate what the Tadrat Akakis has revealed and what it still conceals. The landscape that surrounds us has not changed in its visible aspect since researchers first documented its rock art nearly a century ago. The same eroded towers and wind-carved formations, the same colours shifting through the spectrum as the light angle changes, the same silence broken only by wind and the occasional cry of a bird that has somehow found sustenance in this austere environment. But our understanding of what lies beneath that visible surface has changed profoundly, transformed by technologies that did not exist when earlier generations asked their questions about Saharan prehistory. The desert that seemed empty has been revealed as potentially full. The landscapes that appeared devoid of human modification now suspected of harbouring settlement patterns that rival those of better-known prehistoric cultures. What seemed known has become uncertain. What seemed settled has been reopened. The mysteries that structure human engagement with this extraordinary region have multiplied rather than diminished. And so we return to the questions with which this journey began, though we return transformed by what we have encountered. The eye of the Sahara stares upward from its circular depression, its origin still debated, its relationship to human history still uncertain. The Garamantes foggaras stretch beneath the sand, preserving a technology that made impossible settlement possible, a knowledge system that vanished when the conditions that sustained it changed. The rock art of the Green Sahara records a world that no longer exists, a wet and living landscape that memory alone could not preserve, that only stone and paint have transmitted across millennia of desiccation. Zazura remains unfound, its whiteness unconfirmed, its existence suspended between legend and detection, a possibility that satellite anomalies keep alive without confirming. Meroë's pyramids rise against the Nubian sky, their inscriptions tantalizingly unreadable, their civilization's end unexplained, their buried archives perhaps waiting for excavations that may never come. The Tichit-Walata settlements lie scattered across Mauritania, their planned layout suggesting social organization that the desert subsequently erased. And now the Tadrat Akakis reveals through technology what surface inspection never suspected, patterns of prehistoric settlement that challenge assumptions and demand revision of models that seemed adequate until new evidence arrived. The Sahara has swallowed much, but it has also preserved much, and the relationship between what it has taken and what it has kept defines the discipline of Saharan archaeology, perhaps defines the human relationship with this extraordinary landscape. The desert is not merely hostile but archival, not merely destructive but protective, a paradox of preservation through desolation that has no parallel elsewhere on Earth. The very aridity that made human life impossible after the wet phases ended also ensured that evidence of that life would survive across thousands of years, mummified by dryness, shielded by sand, waiting for technologies and questions that the original inhabitants could not have imagined. The people who painted the Akakis rock art, who built the Tichit-Walata settlements, who engineered the Garamantes water systems, who raised the Meroitic pyramids, did not know that they were creating records for posterity, did not anticipate that their works would outlast their worlds, could not have conceived of the questions that would someday be asked about their vanished ways of life. They acted for their own purposes, lived their own lives, and disappeared into the transformations that time brings to everything human. What remains is what the desert chose to keep, or what the desert was unable to destroy, the involuntary archive of a vanished green world. The night comes quickly in the Sahara, the sun dropping below the horizon, and darkness following within minutes, the lingering twilight of more temperate latitudes absent, where the atmosphere is so clear that light does not scatter, does not soften the transition from day to night. The stars emerge in numbers that urban dwellers have forgotten exist, thousands upon thousands of points of light filling a sky unstained by artificial illumination, the same sky that arched over Paleolithic painters and Neolithic herders and Bronze Age engineers and Iron Age kings. Under that sky, the questions that have structured this journey seem both urgent and irrelevant, pressing for answers that might come and indifferent to timescales that dwarf human concerns. What civilization might have flourished here during the Ice Age, when conditions we can barely imagine prevailed across terrain we think we know? What knowledge was developed and lost? What achievements erased by the same processes that created the conditions for their emergence? What lies beneath the sand that we have not detected, that we lack the technology to find, that waits for investigators who have not yet been born? The wind that blows across the Tadrata carcass tonight is the same wind that has blown for thousands of years, carrying sand and dust and the very molecules that once composed the bodies of those who lived here when living here was possible. In that wind, if we could but read it, is written the entire history of this place, every life and every death, every construction and every abandonment, the complete story of human presence in a landscape that would ultimately reject human habitation. But we cannot read the wind, can only feel it against our faces and hear its voice among the rocks, a voice that says nothing we can understand and everything we need to know. The desert keeps its secrets not through malice but through indifference, not through intention but through being what it is, a place where time moves differently, where the ordinary assumptions of permanence and change require revision, where the very categories that structure human thought about past and present lose their accustomed meanings. The journey ends here, among the eroded towers of the Akarkas, beneath a sky that has witnessed transformations beyond imagining, in a landscape that has been both garden and grave. We have travelled thousands of kilometres from the circular anomaly of the Rishat structure to the pyramids of Meroë to this final destination, where technology has begun to reveal what patience alone could never discover. Along the way, we have encountered mysteries that remain unresolved, questions that may never be answered, evidence that points in directions mainstream scholarship has yet to follow. The Sahara has yielded some of its secrets, but it has kept more, and the ratio between what is known and what is suspected, between what has been confirmed and what remains conjectural, tilts heavily toward the latter. We know so little, and we suspect so much, and the gap between these states defines the attraction that this vast and desolate and beautiful and terrible landscape holds for those who are drawn to its margins and occasionally bravely into its depths. The last light fades from the western sky, and the desert settles into its nighttime silence, a quiet so profound that the pulse becomes audible in one's own ears, that the small sounds of cooling rock seem loud against the absence of other noise. Somewhere beneath this surface lie the answers to questions that have not yet been asked, the evidence for histories that have not yet been imagined, the remnants of lives that have not yet been remembered. The sand that swallows also preserves, the desert that kills also protects. And in that paradox lies the enduring fascination of this place, the reason that researchers will return again and again, that technologies will be deployed and questions formulated and expeditions mounted, that the search for what the Sahara has hidden will continue as long as human curiosity persists. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient courses, indifferent to human presence, indifferent to human questions, keeping their own counsel, as they have since long before this desert existed, as they will long after it has transformed into something else. But down here, where the sand still holds warmth from the vanished sun, where the rock art waits in darkness for another dawn, where the buried settlements sleep beneath their shrouds of sediment, the questions remain, patient as the desert itself, waiting for answers that may come or may not, that may matter or may not, but that cannot be abandoned, because to abandon them would be to abandon something essential about what it means to be human in a world full of mysteries. The Sahara has swallowed much, but it has not swallowed wonder, and that perhaps is enough.